Thank you, Nigel. Good morning and welcome to the meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board. My name is Councillor Tom Smith. I am the Vice Chairman of the Board. The Chairman, Councillor Robert Parker, has sent his apologies today, so I will be in chair of the meeting on his behalf. Could I welcome all members in attendance today and also officers attending both here and in the Council Chamber and also Microsoft Teams. The video feed of this meeting is being broadcast live via the County Council website, and I would also like to welcome members of the press and public watching the meeting online today. I'd like to welcome the following Executive Councillors and Executive Support Councillors who are attending the meeting today. Councillor Richard Boothroyd, Executive Councillor for People Management, Legal and Corporate Property, and Councillor Mark Whittington, Executive Support Councillor for Resources, Commissioning and Communications. Just a reminder before I carry on, the mics are directional, so make sure they're off if you're going to have a quiet conversation whilst you're not speaking, because they may pick them up. I'd also like to welcome the following members of the corporate leadership team: Debbie Barnes, Chief Executive; Andrew Crookham, Executive Director for Resources; and James Drury, Executive Director for Commercial. I'd like to also state there is with a health and safety announcement, as always, there is no fire drill planned for this morning. In the event of a fire alarm sounding, we need to leave the council chamber through the rear doors and leave the building through the reception into the car park, where we will then wait further instructions. If you wish to ask a question during the course of the debate, as usual, please raise your hand, and Nigel, Head of Democratic Services and Statutory Scrutiny Officer, will make a note of those who wish to speak. Right. Apologies for absence, please.
Thank you, Chairman. We've received apologies from Councillor Parker, and we have Councillor Mrs. Kelly in place of him today. Thank you. Oh, sorry, can I also note the leader's apologies?
Thank you, Emily. Any declarations of interest, please note that members can make these at any time during the meeting as well if something comes up. Minutes of the meeting, January 27th, 2022. These have obviously been circulated to everybody before. If everybody's happy with these minutes and there's no queries, could I have a seconder that these minutes are a true and accurate record, please? Thank you, Councillor Strangle. Thank you, Councillor Pepper. All those in favour, please show. Any abstentions and any against? Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Chairman's announcements. I attended the meeting of the Executive on the 8th of February on behalf of the Chairman and presented the Board's comments on the Council's budget proposals for 2022-23 and highlighted our points in relation to the impact of the reduction of the Highways Maintenance Grant, as well as pressures on adult social care and the introduction of smarter working and possible savings which could be achieved. Are there any executive announcements from Councillor Mark Whittington on behalf of Councillor Martin Hill, Leader of the Council?
Thank you and good morning, Mr. Chairman. I've got no announcements. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Whittington. Councillor Boothroyd, do you have any announcements?
Thank you, Chairman. No announcements at this time.
Thank you. Chief Executive Debbie Barnes.
Thank you very much. No announcements from me.
Thank you. Andrew Crookham, Chief Executive Director of Resources.
Nothing, thank you, Chair.
Okay. And James Drury, Executive Director of Commercial.
Nothing from me either, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Consideration of call-ins. Emily, are there any call-ins to consider?
No, none received, Chairman.
Thank you. Consideration of councillor calls for action. Emily, have we received any calls for action?
No, none received, Chairman.
Thank you. To the substantive items on the agenda, the first is the People Management Update Quarter 3. The report provides an update on the HR management information, corporate HR projects for Quarter 3. I'd like to welcome Tony Kavanagh, Assistant Director of HR and Organisational Support, who is attending the meeting in the Council Chamber, to present the report. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Just to confirm, this is just to give some edited highlights in terms of the current position regarding HR management information and where we are with some of our key sort of people strategy projects. In terms of some of the information you have before you, the things to note really, and I'll take employments and voluntary turnover together because they are quite linked. As you will see, the trend in terms of overall employments within the council has continued to rise by about 107. The issue we have, I think, is that because of the return to sort of pre-pandemic situation in employment and workforce, we have seen a further rise towards the end of Q3 in terms of our turnover. I don't think this isn't unexpected. It is something that we were expecting, given the exceedingly low turnover rates we had during the pandemic. But clearly what it has done is reaffirm some of the issues we knew pre-pandemic around some of the pressures within some of our key roles within the council. And clearly there is work ongoing within the council in terms of trying to improve that position from an attraction and retention perspective, which I'll come on to later. Not surprisingly, again, with us moving out of the pandemic situation and with the turnover being as it is, and with vacancies, that there has been pressure on agency spend as well, with an increase to about likely to be about £5.77 million, which is a big increase on last year. But again, no surprise. But clearly, you know, the importance of agency spend is there in terms of the vacancies that we have within some of our sort of key services within adult care, children's services, and legal. In terms of sickness absence, the council has a benchmark target of around 7.5 days per whole-time equivalent, full-time equivalent. That has now risen to 7.63, so we are over that at the moment. That's the sort of first month that we've seen that increase. Not surprisingly, the reasons for that are attributed to some of the viral situation around cold flu, and some of that you would get with the more seasonal illnesses as people return. And there's also been an increase in mental health absences as well, which I think has been largely down to the impact that the COVID situation has had on the workforce. And obviously we have a number of interventions around that you can see there in the paper in terms of support for our workforce, in terms of those that have mental health conditions and such like. On to issues of people strategy. So in terms of attraction and retention, this has been obviously deemed as the #1 priority for the council within the people strategy. There's been lots of work going on regarding the preparing a framework of options of short, long-term and medium-term to our services. That is now up and running, and our services are deciding in terms of which particular options that will benefit them to enable a better retention or recruitment rate. So, as I say, that's in place now, and there's also some work that we're doing at the centre around reducing our time to hire and understanding our fill rates around our vacancies and where the sort of pressure points are. Good news on the apprenticeships. Total number of apprenticeships at the beginning of this year was 269 on roll, and that is a cost of 2.8 million. And just to reiterate again that just below 70% of apprenticeship training provision is delivered by our local providers, which is good. The only other area of note, two areas of note to point out, obviously, the employee survey was conducted at the end of last year, and we've obviously been analysing the results of that. We had a response rate of around 44%, which was slightly lower than the previous survey in 2019. However, the way that we measure the engagement score, which is based on a number of factors, that had increased slightly to 4.06, with the previous one being around 3.97, I believe. I think just to pick out the sort of positive areas first, which was in terms of improvements on last year, employee involvement in decision-making and processes, freedom and empowerment to organise work, operating as one council, and employees taking regular breaks, and employees working when they should be taking sick leave. There were all sort of positive responses compared with 2019. There were, of course, some areas for improvement which weren't as strong as previously, which was about career development, talent management, council's values, health and well-being, and resilience. Some of those probably weren't a surprise because of, again, the pandemic situation and the feeling of isolation, particularly for some individuals around the health and well-being. But overall, it was a positive work survey, and clearly there are areas for improvement, but we'll be picking that up through the People Strategy work plan. Just a final thing to note is really that we obviously launched the Smarter Working Policy in September last year, but then clearly there was a further request from government around where possible people to work from home. So it's pleasing to note that the Smarter Working Policy is now fully operational, and we have obviously the Lancaster House and county offices on the Newland campus open, as well as obviously some of the localities are now open. So the key thing is that there's no changes to terms and conditions, and contractual work bases remain as they were pre-pandemic, so no additional cost burden as a result of that. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for that report. Councillor Wootton.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Our staff are our most valued asset in Lincolnshire Council. The last survey you mentioned, I remember it came before this committee, and 46% of people felt lonely working from home. Now, I'm concerned about their welfare, their mental health welfare. How will they feel when, as from today, everybody is back at the office, according to the government, and the pandemic is over, which is not. So many people speak to me and say that they are scared to go back to work. How are you going to cope and encourage people to return to their desks? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. In terms of obviously the Smarter Working Policy offers a hybrid approach in terms of people and how they work. In some professions, clearly that isn't possible, and as they have been during the pandemic, they've been working on the front line, as it were. But for those people that have had the option of hybrid working and working from home, we do have the facility that where people, for health and well-being reasons, want to come into the office, they can and are supported. And we had a number of examples actually during the pandemic where people were suffering with mental health issues, and with social distancing we enabled people to come back into work. And so that position is still stands, that if we have individuals who would for health reasons want to come into work and work predominantly from their offices, they can do that. And it's been part of the policy, been part of the communications that we've had, and it's for individuals to speak to their line managers and have those discussions. So in a sense, we can look after individuals who are suffering detriment, if it were, as a result of working from home. In addition to that, of course, we have quite a large number of health and well-being initiatives, the usual employee support and counselling, as well as we've had numbers of workshops online and such like for people, for support, and we're hoping that soon we'll be able to launch a sort of assessment process for mental health as well, with a specialised provider within the NHS.
Did you want to come
If I
back?
come back?
Councillor?
Yes, please, Chairman. The question I was also going to ask is, 2 years we've been in the pandemic, working from home, have many of our staff seen as an opportunity for themselves actually to leave the council and diverse and go and work somewhere else? Have we lost a lot of staff through that process? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. What we've seen is, during the last 2 years, has been largely a period of stagnation, and whereby turnover rates have generally been much lower, because people haven't actually wanted to take risks and move. What we have seen now is a return to pre-pandemic movement, I'd say, of the workforce. And so the opportunities that are out there now in terms of working in certain professions where you don't necessarily have to be within the area that you're working because you can work from home, that is clearly a test for all employers. And I think the key thing for us is that we're making sure that we have plans in place and support to make sure that where possible our employees stay. And as I say, we're offering a number of initiatives and interventions to try and steady that. All that said, I don't think we are an outlier or anything like that in terms of our position. I think we're in a fairly normal and safe position, but we can't rest on our laurels in terms of taking action.
Thank you, Chairman. It's good to hear that we're looking after our staff. Thank you.
Councillor Kendrick.
Thank you, Chairman. I think with these staff surveys, there's always positives and negatives. Having for many years completed them myself in another organisation, I was particularly heartened to see that the areas that have improved are the employees' involvement in decision-making and processes and freedom to and empowerment. I recall from my previous existence that that was one which my organisation that I was in always scored very poorly on, and I think morale was affected by that. And I think this is encouraging that this is a morale-boosting thing, that people feel engaged and able to be involved in decision-making, because I think that's a very important thing in staff morale. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Brockway.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of points. I'm absolutely delighted about the way we're supporting apprenticeships. I mean, it's so important for our own succession planning as well as it is for the young people themselves. With regard to people leaving, I think actually there's something very healthy about people looking at and readjusting their lives when an opportunity arises. Because as some people leave, other people will come in, and it keeps a comfortable fit going. What I wanted to raise particularly, though, was the smarter working policy, and it's a kind of request, really. One of the things that's always concerned me is the way people struggle into work when they've got their various viruses and their colds, especially things like sneezing colds. And Sajid Javid this week has come out and told people not to struggle into work under those circumstances. And I agree. I mean, if you look around this room, I've talked to 5 or 6 people this morning at close quarters, at which point, if I'd had a cold, I'd probably have infected Debbie, James, Phil, and quite a few around the room. Excuse me, which is what you do. But in order to facilitate people to stay away when they are sneezing and coughing and passing all their bugs to everybody, we need to make sure that our sickness policy isn't punitive. And I think ours can be under certain circumstances. It's not punitive on all occasions, but it can hit 1 or 2 staff in an unfortunate way. You know, good staff who are working hard, the way their sickness lies can push them onto the different levels of intervention. when perhaps that's unfortunate. So I was wondering if there was any way of looking at and furthering the concept of working in such a way that people who are sneezing and coughing actually don't come in, but are not punished. I don't know how you would take that forward, but is this something that could be looked at, please?
Thank you. In essence, it's something that we have operated to some extent over the last couple of years. So we've always, in terms of the COVID pandemic, obviously, there have been certain situations when people having a virus, they weren't sure whether that was COVID or not. But if they felt well enough to work, then they were able to do so from home. And obviously those that were even COVID positive but fell able to work have been able to do so from home. So I think with the smarter working policy and the flexibility that we have around hybrid working, we are quite happy for people who have a cold or feel unwell but able to work in some capacity to do so from home. And so we're not requiring people to come in. There will of course be some exceptions to that, which within perhaps frontline roles where an individual is needed, particularly, for example, in a residential, children's residential home. But clearly, at the end of the day, the management of absence is about managerial discretion as well. It's not about necessarily dealing with everything with a stick. So I think we've got that fine balance, I would say. But obviously, ultimately, we do have a responsibility as well around managing attendance. But I'm very confident that as a council, we're not too punitive and that we take a really balanced approach.
I've asked the chair. Yes, I've asked the chairman if I might come back briefly. That's very reassuring. Thank you ever so much. There's one further thing out of what you said. I was wondering if it would be possible to kind of support a culture where people feel able to continue wearing masks if they want to. Now, that probably sounds silly. Of course we can wear masks if we want to, but I have actually seen one or two instances of pressure on people not to. Oh, it's silly, or we've got to get on with our lives and all the rest of it, which is very wrong. I mean, the Japanese have a culture that if they have a cold or something like that, they put a mask on out of courtesy for the people around them. And I think that's a very healthy way forward to make sure that that freedom is put in and kept for people's health without any pressure to do something that they're not comfortable with. But I'm very delighted with the things you're telling me. Thank you. Thank you.
No problem. Councillor Dilks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. I concur with the comments, particularly Jack has just said about the masks, particularly. People have got to feel, and masks are going to be part of society from now on in a way that a couple of years ago we would have thought was monstrous. But the points I wanted to make was about the sort of working at home. I mean, the COVID pandemic is actually, almost a silver lining that comes out is the opportunities of new ways of working that I understand we are, properly looking at and coming up with, opportunities that people may be able to work 2 days at home and 3 days in the office or the other way round. And I think that will hopefully get over some of these mental health challenges, if I can put it that way. Because, I worked a history of work, I worked home, self-employed for about 15 years over one period and then went into offices, and I can see the differences and I can see what people sort of think. Just being on your own, it's got advantages, but there are disadvantages too. So I'm hoping, and of course some of those new ways of working will mean money-saving ways as well for the council, hopefully. But I also wanted to sort of raise what nobody else has yet raised at the bottom of page 20, the comparison with the previous survey and the areas that had not improved, particularly the feeling that people had a fair opportunity to progress and develop their career. And I just wondered, you know, what can we do about that? And I don't know if the Chief Executive might want to comment on that as well. You know, what initiatives might we or are we bringing in to sort of challenge that? And, you know, what did that just come up in the 2019 or was it there previously as well? You know, thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the sort of career development and talent and the ability to progress, it's one of the key. So we launched the People Strategy last year, in the middle of last year, and of the 9 sort of key areas, talent management and career development is one of the one of the keystones around that. In terms of where we are with that, I would say that we're not as where we would like to be, which is probably evident in the survey. But you know, we offer a number of opportunities in terms of the apprenticeship program to help people in their internal apprenticeships, and they don't have to be on apprentice pay or be apprentices. So we offer a number of sort of level 5 and soon level 7 type apprenticeships, which can help people do things like master's degrees and such like as they are working. So I'm hoping that amongst generally, you know, the fact we do have a turnover that is healthy in one respect, that will enable people to progress. Given one pleasing thing that has come out recently is around our secondments, that when we're offering secondments, that the take-up of secondments has been largely undertaken at a senior level and sort of middle level from female employees who, whilst they make up the large proportion of the council, are not always, particularly that sort of middle management leadership level, are not proportionally represented within that grouping. And that development within the secondments, particularly in those more senior levels, with the uptake of our female, I think is really encouraging. Hopefully that provides some reassurance. But we do have work to do on sort of talent management and such like.
Chief Exec.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to come in on this as well. And obviously, as an individual who joined the authority in 2006 and have had the pleasure and the privilege of working across a whole raft of jobs and going through that career ladder myself, I would agree and feel really passionate that we need to provide as many opportunities as possible for our own staff to grow and develop. Having personally benefited from those opportunities that the council's given me. And when I look across the senior leadership team, there is quite a lot of grow your own that we do, which I think we need to be proud of. But of course, unless you're moving forward, you're going backwards. So it's something that you can never take your foot off the accelerator around. So would agree with Tony. I think secondments and allocating people to do projects is an excellent way to talent spot and give people opportunities. Again, I think we need to make it a bit easier from a HR perspective to be able to offer those secondments. It can sometimes be quite bureaucratic, and I know that that's something that Tony's looking at. We're a good council, and so many of our partners, not only in sort of shared roles, but also in the work that they're doing, also come to us to ask us if we've got talents that we could then spot and be able to allocate people to partner projects and secondments. And we've obviously seen that recently through COVID around some of the strategies around the local resilience forum, as well as working with health. Tony's mentioned the apprenticeship program, and then quite a lot of our service areas do a grow your own sort of program, particularly around those hard to recruit areas such as social workers, planners, legal, so that we've got a career pathway from almost people coming in or all the way through up to senior positions. Again, I think there's some more work that we can do with the university. We offer some really excellent business support posts during the holidays for university students. I think if we could better match them, so for example, if somebody's doing a health and care degree and is interested in social work, if we could put them into a social work business support environment and almost keep a connection, then you keep that pipeline going. So although we're doing stuff, as Tony rightly says, there's more that we can do, and I think that we can link closer with the universities to look at who are doing the type of courses that we want and really throw our arms around them and love them a bit more to try and get them to come and work here.
Do you wish to come back, Councillor Stokes? Yeah, thank you. It's quite right. I've got a question before I ask for another one, if that's all right. Tony, outside of the existing strategies that we have as a council, what more are we doing? That's part one. Part two is, what impact do you think the government mandated sort of salary infrastructure on local authorities, what impact is that having in terms of people leaving and sort of trying to compete? Because obviously the private sector and other areas aren't sort of as hand-tied in terms of what sort of remuneration and other packages they can offer. And then slightly different point on is, we have the percentage turnover, but do we have any data on where that percentage predominantly hits? At what level? Is it low level? Is it middle management level? Is it, just to sort of boil that down more so we as a committee can understand where the turnover's coming from? Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the first question around remuneration and such like, I think there's no doubt about it. It's a competitive world out there in public and private industry, and we know from a recent report that within the region of I think it was in the region of 300,000 people who were working pre-pandemic, I know decided during the pandemic that they were no longer available for work and in sort of key roles. So there as has been reported, there's been a key dip in the nature of the workforce within the United Kingdom, and obviously that has a knock-on effect in various ways with ourselves. I think there's a couple of things. I think in terms of our offer as a council, and are we competitive, I'd say yes. I think what we are doing is we are particularly, apprenticeships, we've talked about them. We offer a really, really good apprenticeship salary for people coming in at entry level, when you think about the national provision. One area I think that for our staff that are probably struggling with at the moment is around the inflationary pay award, which is still not yet resolved, and that at a national level is we're hoping will be resolved within a matter of days, but clearly spending a long period of time without any inflationary upload when, as we all know, the cost of living has gone up is a factor. So people will know more than likely look around within their communities and such like. But I think, going forward within some of these key roles that we have got actions around. Debbie mentioned one around the Grow Your Own. We're looking to try and expand that. And through our attraction and retention framework, and there are also some short-term pay initiatives we can look at as well as part of the recruitment and retention. So I think in summary, it's a very difficult market. But I think as a council, in terms of our offer, in terms of marketing that offer, we're doing well and doing our best in a difficult situation, if that helps.
Mm-hmm. It does. On my third question, Tony, is there a way we could break down the percentage of those that are leaving in terms of churn? I don't know how much work that would take for you or your officers, and I wouldn't want to try to overburden, but I think it would be helpful for us as a committee to know where the churn is coming from, what level it's coming from, what, if possible, almost drill down to which department, because if it's, say, adult social care, we can look and go, oh, that's partly a national issue. If it's, I don't know, say highways or planning, it might be, we might have to look a bit closer to home in ourselves if that's something that's doable.
Yeah, no, that is doable. I mean, anecdotally, it is generally some of the sort of lower levels in some areas. So in our business support function, we are seeing quite a high turnover, and also difficult to recruit in that for younger people. And also it is the hard to recruit to areas as well, where people will tend to move around because of perhaps a better offer in a neighbouring authority or such like. But absolutely, we can do some more development around the turnover and where those pinpoints are.
Thank you. If no one else has any questions, seeing none. Actions required. The actions required by the board is to seek assurance from HR management information and note progress on the 21-24 people strategy projects. I propose that the board has reviewed the report and has been assured on HR management, and that we note the progress of the strategy. As we've sort of summarised our feedback quite detailed in terms of what we are doing, looking after staff and the retention of staff, and also where the churn in terms of leaving is coming from. Could we please have a vote if we are agreed to the recommendation? All in favour, please show. That looks unanimous. I will offer any against, any abstentions. Seeing none, that's carried. Thank you. Item 8. This is a pre-decision scrutiny prior to the decision by the Executive on the 1st of March. I'd like to welcome Caroline Jackson, Head of Corporate Performance, who is attending today via Teams to present the report. Welcome also to Heather Sandy, Executive Director, Children's Services, Andy Gutherson, Executive Director of Place, and Andrew McLean, Assistant Director, Corporate Transformation Program and Performance, who are also in attendance by Teams. To help answer any questions, over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Just checking that you can hear me okay.
I can, thank you, yes.
Lovely, thank you. Yes, in terms of the report, it's page 25 in your pack, which sets out the performance of the corporate plan in relation to the priorities identified. So just as a reminder, we have two ways in which we report that performance. We have key activities, so those things that underpin the delivery of the plan, and also key performance indicators, our KPIs, which you'll all be familiar with. We have obviously got the full detail of the KPIs and the activities on the Council's website, and we did circulate a guide for members on how to navigate the website, which I hope has been useful, and would certainly welcome any feedback if there's further changes we need to make to that. In terms of talking through the headline performance then, so we have slightly changed our RAG rating in the from the Q2 report, just so that we can be really clear on the activities where we need to escalate in terms of the amber and red RAG rating. So in terms of this report for Q3, we have 32 activities that we can report on. As I say, all fully detailed on the Council's website. Of those 28, so 88% are actually progressing as planned. And only 4 are amber rated, which is where a current milestone, so something within the activity is slightly behind, but overall we're confident that the activity will still be delivered. But we bring those up into the report in terms of being amber rated to give you early kind of headline and insight into those. So in terms of those 4 activities that are amber rated, we have under supporting high aspirations, we have activity A10, which is around us achieving net zero carbon emissions as a council by 2050. Full details, as I say, is in the report as well. We did launch the climate partnership, which was delayed. The launch of the climate partnership has been delayed because of government community resilience funding wasn't forthcoming, but we are working to source alternative funding, and that is being explored at the moment. So it's not going to necessarily delay the overall activity, but there obviously is a milestone there that we're continuing to work towards. Activity A12 is around us maximising the reuse and recycling potential of our waste. Again, we are overall on plan, but within that, we have just completed some workshops with district council partners and are in discussions with other kind of neighbouring authorities, and paper and card bin rollout is completed in North Kesteven and will commence in West Lindsey from April. A42, as Tony's already touched on in the previous item, which is around the refresh of our corporate people strategy. Again, we've had to pause some aspects of the strategy in order to ensure that the attraction and retention has taken precedent in terms of activity, as Tony laid out in the earlier item. And then finally, A47, which is around transforming the way we engage with our customers through the implementation of the customer strategy. Again, work still progressing, but we're just in the process of agreeing a work programme around the customer digital delivery, so that we can see that increase in the range of self-service solutions available to customers and reduce that demand on our contact centre, which will ultimately reduce costs. So they're the 4 activities that are showing as amber at this stage. In terms of the KPIs, so we actually have 2 types of key performance indicators that we're reporting in the plan. We have those where we have set an ambition or a target. Again, we've talked about this in the previous meeting. And of those that we've got a target set, we actually have 8 that we can report performance on in Q3. And of those 8, 6 of them, so 75%, are actually achieving that ambition or target. So really positive to know that the percentage of children in care living in a family environment, the percentage of schools that are judged good or outstanding, and the percentage of pupils in good or outstanding schools are all achieving their ambition, along with the percentage of 16 and 17-year-olds not in education, employment or training, days lost to sickness absence per FTE, and also the percentage of people who remain home 91 days after hospital discharge, all are achieving their target. So really positive outcome there. The 2 measures that we have targets for that are not achieving those targets, the first one, again, we've discussed at previous meetings, is around the percentage of superfast broadband coverage in residential and business premises. Again, in the report, there's an extensive narrative around the reasons why we aren't achieving that target. Around the growth in the number of premises that are actually included in the count now for this measure, as well as obviously, I'm sure you're aware of delays in availability of equipment and the semiconductor shortages, which has been worldwide, and the availability of other key equipment in order to ensure that we can progress as we need to. There's also some detail in the narrative around the expectations around gigabyte capability and moving to much higher speeds than super fast broadband, which I know for some just having super fast broadband would be a good place to be, but certainly looking at that gigabyte target by 2025. The second measure that we haven't achieved our target is around the rate of children in care per 10,000 population. Again, we are above this target in terms of the numbers. We have seen a steady increase in the numbers of starters of children in care since Q2, quite a reasonable increase in terms of 39%, and our leavers has remained fairly static, hence why we're seeing that increased number. We do know that the numbers are partly attributable to the number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children that we arrived as part of the temporary mandated scheme for all local authorities in relation to the National Transfer Scheme. There is an explanation in the narrative, but I can clarify that of the 716 children in care as at the end of December, which is the reporting period, 31 of those were unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. What I would say is, despite this increase, we have had some nationally published data recently, which shows that Lincolnshire's children in care per 10,000 still remains significantly below both national and statistical neighbour comparisons. So we are showing that we have 48 per 10,000 population, and in terms of nationally that is 67, and statistically neighbours is 63.4. So we are still significantly below. So they are the two KPIs that are underperforming. Now, the next set of KPIs is something that we've introduced in this quarter. And as you'll remember from previously discussing the reporting, we have a number of KPIs that do not have a target set for them. But what we've done is we've worked with our exec directors to give a contextual rating. Now, this contextual rating comes to you in the form of the report, but it isn't shown on the council website. It's more of a headline and a kind of an early identification of areas that are either performing really well or actually areas where we would like to see an improvement in performance. So in terms of those areas that are performing well, we want to acknowledge that the crime rate has reduced in the last 12 months to December 2021 compared with the same period in 2020. And we've seen a decrease in antisocial behaviour in the last 12 months. So overall, the crime rate is reducing. In terms of the ratio of business births to deaths and the percentage of businesses born each year that have survived for 3 years, again, both really positive reporting and want to highlight as really good progress. And similarly, we've seen a really positive output in terms of visitors to heritage attractions. We're bucking the trend in relation to those increasing numbers. We've twice as many visitors as we reported in Q1, and we're really starting to see people choosing to engage with our heritage sites, and particularly some of the free grounds visits to Lincoln Castle have been incredibly positive. So really starting to see really positive impact of our visitors to heritage attractions. There are then, as I say, some measures where we are working to see some improvements on. Firstly, around the percentage of facilities rated good or outstanding by the Care Quality Commission in relation to adult social care. So we do have formal improvement plans in place with multi-agency support, so those providers who aren't meeting the requirements. Additional investment is being made for the provision of targeted support to those providers that need it. And we're looking to really empower them to improve their service and reduce reliance on the council support, and really working with them to move as many of those facilities to be good or outstanding. The total number of complaints received, again, we have seen a slight reduction in Q3 on the number of complaints, and we have seen an percentage of those that are resolved early increasing, but we do appreciate that our complaints are higher than they have been this time last year. We've put additional resource in to work in that area to ensure that training is provided on that early resolution, and that we ensure that there is a positive outcome for our customers. Staff who voluntarily left LCC, again, Tony's already touched on this. We are seeing an upward trend. Again, the people strategy, as Tony's outlined, we are working on with that very much focused on attraction and retention. And the culture and leadership stock take, which will be undertaken early this year, will also support that. We then finally, we have a category around the employment within the county, and in particular those in skills categories that are highly skilled job categories. And again, we want to see an increase in this area, but fully appreciate that, you know, we have got a very particular sector in relation to employment within Lincolnshire, but we are working in partnership with the Greater Lincolnshire at LEP and the Employment and Skills Advisory Panel to look at how we can move into that sector being, you know, we're moving people into a higher skilled sector. We have actually outlined then in section 4.6, we've proposed a number of those KPIs that we actually formally set targets for. You might remember we had this discussion at the last meeting, and we're looking to seek obviously approval to progress those setting targets for those from Q1. So we'll report them for the 22-23 reporting year. I'll now hand over for any questions.
Thank you for that. Councillor Brockway.
Thank you, Chairman. I have 3 questions, if I may. Thank you ever so much for all that information. It's very interesting. So 3 completely separate questions. So if I just give them to you, then you can answer them as you like. First of all, you mentioned the bins and the rollout of the food waste, which I absolutely support. Sorry, I'm thinking of a different one now. The purple bins, the card and the paper, which I absolutely support. Most of my recycling waste is in fact card and paper. But I'm having an awful lot of queries from different parts of my division, from people who have absolutely no room for another bin, people in terraced houses, where are they to put these bins? And the other thing is concern about side waste. That is no longer going to be collected, certainly in West Lindsey, but not everybody can take a Stanley knife and cut up card to get it into the bin. It can be very difficult if you're buying big items, appliances and things like that, and people are quite worried about this. So certainly lack of side waste and where are they going to put their bins? That's the first question. My second question is a separate thing, and it's to do with one of the council's ambitions, which can be seen on page 30, which is to enable everyone to enjoy life to the full. I actually think this ambition shouldn't be in here because you're trying to put quantifiable objective outcomes on something which is completely subjective. You know, so we've got here that it's progressing as planned, that you've got 6 activities, and it's very difficult to understand what activity you can put in place and can then give a mark to, if you like, that shows a level of enjoyment. For example, what are you doing to help me enjoy my life to the full? When I put it like that, it sounds kind of silly, and I am worried about ambitions like that going into a document where we do need to show progress and success. So there, my second question then is about that particular ambition, about enjoying life. And the last one is about children in care. The figure 716, that we are lower than similar authorities and lower than the national figures, which is great, probably. But could I just ask why we are lower? Is it because we are intervening differently at an earlier stage with families that are troubled? Or are we taking them into care later? So if you could let me know why we think our figures are lower than comparable authorities. So there's quite a lot there, and thank you, Chairman, for letting me ask them all. Thank you.
Debbie, Chief Exec.
Thank you. So if I come in on a couple of them, and then I'll probably hand over to Andy. So in relation to the aspiration around living life to the full, I think in terms of overarching ambitions around a council plan and then measuring the impact of the council plan, it's always really difficult because you want it to be all-encompassing, so it feels as though you're wanting to achieve something for every one of your businesses, your residents, and your visitors to the area, whilst actually then being able to have some concrete examples to then be able to measure progress. And you're absolutely right, everybody's needs are very, very, very different, and therefore how do you focus, if you like, the performance information to measure that, because it's such a nuanced individual. I think that's a challenge for all corporate plans across the whole of the country, where all councils try and articulate and assimilate down what is it that they want in simple terms for their residents. So I suppose broadly speaking, if we think about what most people want, if they tell you what makes them happy, is that they want to have a safe place to live, in a home that they enjoy. They want to have some form of employment that enables them to thrive and have a good standard of living, and they want to do positive things. I mean, that's all really broad and strategic, isn't it? And then I suppose the performance indicators are proxy measures to try and look at what are our services to contribute to that. But absolutely accept your point that you can, you know, it does have the risk of sounding a bit like motherhood and apple pie. And I think that's, you know, that's the essence really of corporate plans. And then it's really trying to drill underneath about how your services are trying to contribute to that. We did do a lot of consultation around the language of it to talk to our residents and engage with our residents, and obviously that's then been the outcome of the consultation. But when we do a refresh, obviously we'll look at the language of that again. But I think it is one of the challenges really in relation to corporate plans. And I suppose you want to make it simple, you want to make it short, but it needs to be meaningful, and that's a real dilemma. Heather may wish to come in, but in terms of the numbers of looked after children, absolutely right. You need the right number of children in care at the right level, at the right time. Absolutely, of course you do. Lincolnshire is lower than our comparative neighbours, and we do measure it against local authorities with similar levels of deprivation and similar sort of geography in that. So we don't necessarily measure it against, you know, say Blackpool or those sort of type areas. We would measure it against similar authorities to us, and albeit that we are still low. I think we're low for a number of reasons. This council has continued to invest in early help and support. So without a doubt, we're able to provide preventative support to families. This council has continued to have a strong link with all of its schools. So our schools see that their role is to support vulnerable families. They don't see it as their role just to necessarily refer all families in if they're vulnerable. They see that they've got a role to step into that space to be able to support vulnerable families, again, at the closest point to their community as possible, and only refer to us if they're struggling with that. And I think the third thing that we've invested a lot in the council, and again, the council's invested financially heavily, but also culturally, is to the philosophy of working called Signs of Safety, which is very much a sort of practice where you work alongside families, you work at engage in a family network. So rather than seeking to intervene, you look at what the strengths are available within the family network, within the community, to see whether grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, neighbours, friends can wrap around and provide that level of community support, meaning that a child can be safeguarded. And it's only when those networks can't be mobilised that we then step in. So I think that those are a range of things which means that our children's services is different to others, and those children's services with fairly similar or lower levels of looked after children are also adopt those sort of practices in terms of heavy investment in early intervention. The cardboard waste, again, I'm looking forward to our rollout. We haven't been rolled out in my area yet, but having particularly one teenage girl at home, most of my recycling is also from Amazon and cardboard and all the rest of it. So I think Andy's on the line, so we'll probably get Andy to come in and respond to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Debbie. Morning, members. Councillor Brockway, by the time you get home, you might have a flyer that's come through my letterbox this morning as a West Lindsey resident that actually clarifies a number of the points about the whole rollout. What it also does is directs people to a series of FAQs in respect of this on the West Lindsey website. The rollout is the third of the districts that have had this activity. So a lot of the questions you're raising have been challenged. They've been investigated already into the other districts. In the context of this, for everyone to understand, this is being driven by the requirements of the Environment Act and an expectation on all councils to act differently in terms of how they collect and recycle waste. We do have a degree of choice about how we go down that route, and the initial feedback from the other districts where it's actually happened already, it's been positively received, and it's increasing our recycling rates and increasing the quality of what's recycled. So in terms of your specific question about side waste, the important thing to note is that card and paper has a greater value if it comes back into the collection system at a certain level of quality, and that's about it being dry and uncontaminated. Collecting it concurrently with other waste, bottles and plastics and such like, it tends to get contaminated, it tends to get damp, it tends to get wet, and therefore doesn't have the same value. If it's left out as side waste, therefore again it's open to the elements, and again would not be of the same quality, wouldn't get the same value, and wouldn't actually achieve our aims and ambitions. The advice is very much on the basis of the side where if you've got significant larger quantities, that should be taken to HWRC sites for disposal that way. In terms of the issue around storage, again, the other districts that have already rolled this out, again, have large areas of terrace properties. And there's an indication, again, through the FAQs that people should contact West Lindsey as the collection authority on the back of the flyer that people will be receiving, if not today, this week. And they will make arrangements and discuss with the individuals involved about what that actually means in practice.
Thank you, Chairman. Some excellent answers there all round. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. Councillor Dilks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for the report. A number of points, sort of varied points. I'll throw them all in one go, if I may. First of all, page 31, I welcome the fact that we are seeking alternative funding sources regarding the Green Master Plan and the launch of the Climate Partnership. I am concerned, I've got to say, that most of the money that has been earmarked for the Green Master Plan and the ambition to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, as most of it has been spent, there is some a few £1,000s left in there, but you know we're not going to achieve that if we don't put the money in now and invest in those things. That's just a sort of a comment, really. And then underneath, and picking up really Councillor Brockway's point on the recycling, or a different point on the recycling, I did go to the appendix that sort of gives the narrative on it, but didn't really get a sense from that of what's the percentage that we are achieving of recycling across the county. I appreciate that's, you know, obviously districts have a role in that too, but I wasn't sure, you know, from the appendix what the sort of level is and whether that's acceptable or good. And then moving on to children in care, I know that 716 is children in care is lower than similar councils. I'm not sure whether it's good or bad, to be honest, how many children we have in care. It's a difficult one, isn't it? It's a difficult target, and I pick up what Councillor Brockway says about some of the targets. That is, you know, is it good or bad that we've got so many or so few in care? I do remember, though, last time I was on this council, when the Chief Executive was the Director of Children's Services, having an exchange, and Debbie very kindly coming up with the statistics. But I seem to remember, and Debbie, please correct me if I'm wrong, I thought that at the time we had about 500 children in care, only sort of 5, 6, 7 years ago. So that seems a huge jump. That may be a good thing, I don't know, but I just sort of make that comment that actually it seems to have gone up by 50% or thereabouts, or getting on that way. And then I'm really move on to the previous report. Mr. Kavanagh actually mentioned mental health as being the biggest contributor or the biggest cause for sickness in our staff currently. So I'm kind of moving on to what's not in these KPIs and questioning what perhaps should be, particularly post-pandemic, in the new ways of working. And mental health, children's mental health particularly, I am concerned about, and I think, you know, there is a tsunami coming of children's mental health needs and demands. And I note that Sandy Heather is on the line, and don't know if Sandy might want to comment. But I am concerned, and I did say at council last week, or I didn't, a colleague did, because I wasn't here, I was in isolation. But, you know, I understand that there is a backlog of mental health treatment, and that some children, post-pandemic, if I can call it that, and I appreciate what my friend Councillor Wotton says, it's not over by any means, but post-pandemic, some children, I understand, in Lincolnshire are waiting more than a year now for treatment because of the backlog and all the other things that we've had to do. And that gives me concern, and I just wonder if Sandy would comment on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. But I just think these reports are really useful and helpful. Thank you.
Before I bring Sandy in, would Chief Exec like to comment at all?
I think Heather's on the line.
Yeah,
So
no
it's Heather Sandy. It's that way around. A number of people do that.
Can I just, may I apologise? I'm so sorry.
No problem at all. It's one of those names that's easy to get the wrong way around, and Teams doesn't help because it writes it the wrong way around. So no problem at all. Thank you. So in terms of the numbers of children in care, first of all, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think that's a really good question. What's really important is that we have the right children in care, that when children need to come into care, they do so. We know, we've talked at all of our committees about the impact coming into care has on children. So it is really important that we're working hard to keep children safe with their families wherever that's possible, or with their family networks. To assure the committee, yes, we have seen that rise. That rise has been seen nationally as well. And as Caroline indicated, our rise per 10,000 is actually really small, and is in line with what other people are saying. And the other element of assurance that we can provide, in addition to everything Debbie explained about our early help, about the work we do with our partners, about our model of practice, is that we are inspected by Ofsted regularly, who test all of that and give feedback on how they feel that we're doing. And you'll all be aware we the judge to be outstanding. And we welcome that scrutiny. We engage in peer review with other local authorities, but really confident that we've got our thresholds right and that the right children are coming into care. And the number, as you quite rightly say, putting a target against those things is really challenging. But what I can assure you is that target doesn't prevent us from bringing children into care that need to come into care. It's something we're mindful of, and we look at the reasons why we're increasing. And one of the challenges we've had over the pandemic period is that exiting children from care has been harder because of the backlog in the courts. And so we're starting to see some of that ease up, and we'll start to see that impact as we move through. In terms of children's mental health, I completely agree with your concerns. We are seeing an increase in wait for treatment times. Again, that's been seen nationally, and Lincolnshire's not immune to that. We're seeing those waits in Lincolnshire. Those services are funded by the CCG and provided by the Health Partnership Trust, and we're the lead commissioner for those arrangements. So as I think was discussed at full council last week, we are raising those concerns. I've got a meeting this afternoon with the CCG to formally raise those concerns and look to seek resolutions to that. Thank you.
You don't have a supplementary, do you, Councillor, at all? Anything to come back? Do you want to come back on anything at all?
No, just say thank you for the responses. Thank you.
No problem. Mrs. Councillor Keeley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to pick up what Councillor Brockway mentioned about the target of enjoying life to the full. I think we as a council have got to be a bit careful, because at the moment, a lot of people's enjoying life to the full is outside our control. I mean, in times of, unprecedented, even though austerity, etc., is supposed to have finished, in terms of many families, they're experiencing economic hardship, energy bills are soaring. We've just heard this morning very, very depressing news about what is going on with Russia's invasion. And I just think that target is just so wide and unachievable. We are setting ourselves out to fail. And that's really, even though it's really good that we have a positive outlook on life, I just think it's just too unachievable. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Councillor Strangill, please.
Thank you, Chairman. It's first a comment and then a question. Perhaps Andy might like to answer it through you, Chairman. Certainly it was interesting to hear what Andy said about each district has their own autonomy regarding what they do on waste and recycling. Certainly in Lincoln, we have 3 bins, very briefly, black for obvious, the normal waste, green speaks for itself. But the brown bin not only takes card, paper, takes glass, it takes tin cans, it takes just about everything that you can recycle. So that I'd be more than happy to stick with what we've got at the moment in Lincoln, that's for sure. But my question for Andy is, I remember back in around about 2008, I served on the last JAC committee, which is now the Central Lincolnshire Joint Planning Committee. And we were shown a video of an MRF, which is a material recycling facility, which was excellent, actually, because what it did was it separated anything metal away from paper, etc., etc. And I would like to ask Andy, have we got one in Lincolnshire? Have we got more than one in Lincolnshire? And where are they? Thank you, Chairman.
Andy, if you're able to answer that.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Strengle. Just a correction initially. I didn't specifically say the districts had autonomy. I said the districts are responsible as the waste collection authorities for the collection of the waste. And as you rightly point out, as a consequence of that, there is a slightly different approach taken in each of the districts in terms of what goes in each individual particular bin, different coloured bins, etc. Some of that is a legacy of history in terms of how those recycling activities have developed. The approach that's now been rolled out, of which the West Lindsey rollout of the card and paper collection is the next district, is a more joined up approach. So eventually all of the districts will have the same type of approach. That will result at some point in the City of Lincoln also being on that rollout and alternative bin arrangements to make sure that the card and paper in the city is collected and, as I said earlier, retains a value in the context of the quality of recycled materials. Because for all of the recycled materials that can't be effectively recycled, that is a cost burden to the county council as the disposal authority. Again, what we're finding already, as I say, particularly in Boston, is that the quality of recyclable material is better, and then we're getting a better financial return. So we're receiving an income stream as opposed to just pure costs of having to dispose it through the energy from waste facility. In terms of the alternative ways of disposing and dealing with waste, yes, we have in the past explored the pros and cons of an MRF facility. We don't have one operating in the county at the moment. And in the context of the direction of travel through the Environment Act, the move to actually separate out different waste streams at curbside, at source, actually the chances are of us pursuing an MRF at this stage, I think, is probably quite remote, because the emphasis is on, as I say, that separation at source. An MRF comes into its own where you collect everything in one bin, and then it needs to be sort of collected out and recycled at that point. We're moving away from that sort of model, and the Environment Act clearly pushes in that direction. And as Councillor Brockway indicated earlier, we'll move to food waste collections also being a separate part of that waste stream as well.
Councillor Stringer, you wish to come back?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, you've I put my hand up just before you really answered my question there, but you have answered it, which was about the MRFs. Obviously, I was involved in the Value for Money Committee on this council when we started talking about the energy from waste plant. And we all agreed as a council it was an excellent facility to put in, cost millions of pounds, it works well. And that's why I brought up the MRF side. I would have thought that would have been a next stage for Lincolnshire. It would cost millions of pounds, but it would certainly prove its worth, I think, in the long run. But thank you, Andy, for your answer anyway, and thank you, Chairman.
If I could just respond further, Councillor Smith, if
yes,
that's okay.
Yes, of course, Andy.
Just in that context, one of the things we are exploring is, as waste streams are sort of separated out, is what the next disposal facilities might look like. And particularly if you look at the issue around food waste being collected separately, we are exploring whether actually some sort of anaerobic digester sort of facility would be the way of actually maximising the benefit of the food waste, then creating a heat source in the same way as the value for money discussions that probably took place some 15 years or so ago in terms of the energy from waste plant, recognise the benefits of that. So we will continue to look for new ways of processing and disposing of waste. I just don't expect it will be in the context of an MRF being the solution at this point in time.
Thank you, Andy.
Councillor Wotton.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a comment on page 37 in relation to the crime stats. Now, I'd like to declare that, for clarity, that I'm a member of the Lincolnshire Police and Crime Panel and also a former crime analyst. Those statistics you have in front of you are not the reality of crime in Lincolnshire. Now, if you look at crime over the past 4 to 5 years, you'll see that crime is actually increasing. And one particular area where crime is increasing quite a lot is Skegness. Secondly, to Lincoln, and antisocial behaviour, criminal damage and drugs are quite high. Now, the statistics will not show you that the effort by the Police and Crime Commissioner by recruiting an extra 100 officers and extra police vehicles, extra drug dogs, extra traffic vehicles and extra rural crime officers will hopefully bring this situation down further. So those 3 month statistics you have does not show you the reality in Lincolnshire. Thank you.
To come on to following your point, actually, I must say I have noticed, even in my my division and where I live as well, as I live just outside my division, that the number of officers has made a difference, because even driving, I'm now regularly seeing marked police vehicles, whereas a couple of months ago the running joke was you wouldn't see one. So it's certainly making a difference, and just them being there, or the threat of them being there, I think will help hopefully bring those stats down.
Yes, Chairman, the PCC has introduced new road traffic units, so that's a good idea.
Well, if no one, I've got a few questions, if I may. The number of complaints have risen sharply, as has been alluded to. What's been done to try and reduce the number of complaints that have to be elevated? And could officers advise the committee what the second and third highest departments in respect of complaints are? Because I know it mentions obviously that highways is the first department, and that I can imagine what the complaints are, as we all can, for obvious reasons, but that's not through lack of effort from our highways department and officers.
Thanks, Councillor Smith. So yeah, as you rightly say, complaints related to highways and potholes tend to be our most highest volume. I think off the top of my head, I think it's children's next. Clearly, obviously, we're in the regime of particularly around educational healthcare plans. Really, it can lead to obviously quite differences of opinion that lead to complaints. We can probably provide a further breakdown to a further committee if that would be useful, so we could dig into it a bit more, into a bit more detail. I don't know whether Debbie would like to say any more on it. But.
Just really to add, because Andrew is absolutely right, those are the two highest areas. A number of years ago, we transferred the responsibility for managing complaints back from Serco into the local authority, and done a lot of work on early resolution. The early resolution, so that it didn't actually go into a complaint, but we were able to sort of nip it in the bud early, increased because of the volume of complaints that we've got, particularly during COVID. We've struggled to keep that rate low, so we have put additional resource into that team so that hopefully they can get back to the complainant, get the complainant back in touch with the service to try and resolve things early, so that it doesn't need to go through a formal process. We still count the contacts and obviously report to you in terms of which percentage are achieved through early resolution, but obviously it's better for everybody the more that we can resolve their concerns early.
Thank you both, and I think every councillor here would agree. Obviously, the earlier we can resolve any issues, the better. I think it'd certainly be interesting, certainly from a committee point of view, to have that data. I don't know, and Andrew, you might be able to advise how much work it would be to extract it on a departmental basis as well?
Yeah, we do actually do an annual customer complaints report that goes through the Audit and Governance Committee, which is I guess that's the committee that's been identified as responsible for that. Yeah. But I know Nigel has been looking at closer working between the two committees, and it might be something that we could maybe try and arrange about how we work the pan across possibly.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want? You look like you wanted to come in. Thank you, Andrew. If I'll onto my second question. Could officers possibly add a metric that any external funding from Her Majesty's Government to help diversify our employment sectors in Lincolnshire? Because currently the metric sort of goes into where what our employment sectors are. And obviously it's farming and the areas connected to farming will remain highly dominant within Lincolnshire. But it'd be helpful to know if we had external funding from government, where the funding was coming from, if it was to help diversify employment and what it was being used for.
Thank you. So there's two main routes of government funding to support businesses that come in. I mean, clearly there is some degree of support through the economic development team here, but the vast majority of grants go either through the Greater Lincolnshire Local Enterprise Partnership or through the districts in terms of business support grants. So I don't know if Andy wants to come in and add to that, but I'm not sure that we would have that level of visibility because most of it comes in via the LEP or the district councils rather than us.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that, Councillor Smith, I think we'd only be painting part of the picture, so I'm not sure that it would necessarily add significant value and give rise to more questions than answers. The Levelling Up white paper also sort of raises a number of issues around future funding streams potentially going through districts as well, rather than coming into the county. So it's potentially quite a complicated picture.
Thank you for that clarification, Beth. I think that, as you say, if you're painting half a picture now, getting more questions and answers, it's probably not something worth necessarily doing, because I know it'll be quite time intensive as well. On the customer and the digitisation strategy, how many customers do we expect to use self-service via the website approximately? Obviously, because I know there's no hard data at the moment. And if we overestimate that, do we have any contingency if we need to, for whatever reason, suddenly increase the number of staff in the call centre? Because I know there's obviously if obviously more use a digital service, then there's less staff needed, and vice versa.
James might want to come in afterwards. So obviously we've started to do some work on a digital strategy and on a customer strategy, and we want to look at different channels so that it's easier for customers to be able to access us. So at the moment, the vast majority of calls go in through the customer service centre, but a lot of those calls are what we would call in essence transactional calls, and it probably won't surprise the committee to know that we get thousands of calls as well of people who've gone online and undertaken transactions online, but then ring us up to say, has my transaction gone through? And obviously every time there's a call, because Serco manage the call, that's a cost to us as well. So it's not only customer focused, it's also costly for the council. So we're looking at a piece of work looking at the highest volume, lowest complexity sort of type functions that happen in the customer service centre, to be able to scope out those, which we're just about there on, to then be able to look at what the potential solutions are in order then to perhaps just try one at a time, because obviously not everybody can access online and we wouldn't want to just block off any other, all other avenues. So to sort of try on a very sort of incremental basis to begin to look at the highest volumes first and then sort of go down in terms of volume. So I don't actually think we've set a target yet. I think, again, we need to engage with scrutiny committees and also with the executive about how much people or how much politically there is an appetite to turn off things to actually be able to look at a target. And I think that that's something that we need to really think carefully about in terms of accessibility, as well as much more efficiency. So it's work that I think is at an early stage rather than yet at that stage, and at the appropriate time we'll clearly need to engage politically because of those complexities. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Thank you for clarifying that, Debbie. It's appreciated, because I know it will be when it is at that stage, I know for all of us it will probably be a very emotive issue, because you will have residents that either choose not to or can't access online, and if you, as other councils, not in Lincolnshire but in other areas, as you say, turn a service off, you can have quite understandably a reputational impact, and not in a good way. If there are no more questions, we shall move to the actions required, and they are as follows. The Overview and Scrutiny Board is invited to consider the attached report and to determine whether the Board supports the recommendations to the Executive as set out in the report, agree any additional comments to be passed to the Executive in relation to this item, review and comment on the performance information that is within the remit of the Board, and highlight any recommendations to or further actions for consideration. Can I have a proposer and seconder, please? All those in favour, please show. Any against? And any abstentions? Seeing none on both counts, that's unanimous. Thank you. When I can get my paper to work. Moving on to item 9, Treasury Management Performance 21-22 Quarter 3 to December 31st 21. This report sets out the Treasury Management activities and performance for Quarter 3 to December 3rd 2021. I'd like to welcome Karen, and pardon me if I mispronounce your name, Tonge, T-O-N-G-E. If I mispronounce that, I do apologise. Treasury Manager, who is attending today via Teams to present the report. We also have Sue Maycock, Head of Finance Corporate, in attendance in the Council Chamber to help answer any questions. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, everybody. Before I start, I must apologise in advance. I've kept away from the Council Chamber today because I'm one of those people that's picked up a cold for the first time in 2 years. So I apologise for my delivery and coughing if it occurs. But here we go. This is the quarterly report, update report for Quarter 3, which details Treasury Management activity to the 31st of December 2021, and compares this activity to the strategy that was set for 21-22 this time last year, that was approved on the 11th of March by the Executive Councillor for Resources. As usual, I've broken the activities down to the usual areas of interest rate and economy, investments, borrowing, and then any other ad hoc issues. I'll review the main points of each of these areas briefly, and then take any questions. And I'd just like to say that Chris Scott from Link Asset Services, our Treasury advisors, is here today on the call, who is here for the next paper for the strategy, but hopefully he can take any questions as well. So starting with interest rates and economic activity, excuse me, the graph in Appendix A on page 71 of your pack shows that the MPC raised bank rate by 0.15% back to 0.25% on the 16th of December. And this surprised markets at the time when the impact of the Omicron virus was unknown. And this action was really to fight the emergence of the rising inflation predicted to reach 6% by April at the time. Further 0.25 increases in rate are predicted over the next 2 years, the timing unknown, but rises beyond this is thought to be unlikely as growth remains weak and inflation is still thought to be transitory. Excuse me. Long-term rates fell significantly due to Omicron, as the graph shows, but have recovered since. They're still expected to increase moderately over the next 3 years. I'll pick up the rate movements since the end of December in the following strategy report, because things have moved since then. But in terms of the economy, this has been dominated by the rise of inflation, obviously, during the period, and especially in the rise in the cost of oil, electricity and gas, which has been driving prices up across the board. The MPC has a difficult path to negotiate at the moment that will bring inflation under control, whilst at the same time not dampen an already weakened recovery and growth. So moving to investments, I'll draw your attention to Appendix B, which is page 77 of your pack, and pick out the main points from this bulletin. The chart on the left-hand side of the appendix shows that investment balances have remained at high levels, circa 350 million, whilst interest rates are slowly increasing now as short-term rates are increasing. The council is still exceeding benchmarks, but note its weighted average maturity is coming down, which stood at 116 days from the previous 134. Keeping weighted average maturity lower is the strategy to follow in an increasing interest rate environment, to take advantage of the increasing rates all the time. The stability of the banking sector remains during the period. There's been no breaches of any limits and such of the like during the period either. So I'll turn to borrowing. Again, I'll pick up the main points of the Appendix E this time, which is page 95 of your pack. And this shows that after rephasing of the capital programme, estimates of underspend and adjustment to level of internal borrowing, the borrowing requirement for the year is now 0. So this means that we're not expecting to borrow any external borrowing during the year, which should leave internal borrowing level around 190 million and cash balances around 240 million. The advantage of this strategy, obviously, is to keep financing charges low, but it also reduces counterparty risk by reducing the investment level we have. The level of external debt, as it's shown, will finish the year at just over 476 million, and this is costing around 3.7%. The graph on the bottom of the page also shows that we're still maintaining an even maturity profile. And some temporary borrowing of 34 million was undertaken during the period to meet liquidity shortfalls at a cost of 0.04%, which is below the money market fund level, which is the aim. This is just to tackle liquidity. It's part of the policy and the strategy to do so. And it's not envisaged that any temporary borrowing will be remaining at the end of the financial year. And finally, just some other issues to mention. CIPFA have issued its new Treasury Management Code and Prudential Code, and they issued these on the 21st of December. So due to the late timing of this launch, CIPFA's allowed a soft launch of the new requirements of the codes. And so full compliance of these are not expected until 23-24. And I will pick up the main key changes from these codes in the following strategy paper, if I may, and outline what impact this will have in the current year. And the other last thing to note is the MRP review that Link has undertaken for us. Link's concluded this review, and we're currently assessing the findings to see how any identified savings in the future MRP charge can be implemented. And we'll report our plan of action on this to the committee in June, along with the Treasury Management Annual Report. So that's all I'm going to say on that. So be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Councillor Stringle, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Karen, for your report, very in-depth. I think you answered the question I was going to ask, but I'll just reiterate what I was thinking, which is that you mentioned inflation. In fact, the CPI, which is the thing we should be concerned about, was standing around about 5.1. I think it's on page 64. On page 65, you mentioned that the CPI was likely to peak at 6%. I just wondered, I think you sort of semi-answered your reasoning why you thought it would come down substantially during this year. It looks to me like it could go even higher, but perhaps you'd like to answer that. Thank you.
Do you want me to comment, Karen?
Yes, if you can comment, because I know the expectation is higher now since that I wrote that report. But yes, if you'd like to explain why we think it's going to come down eventually, Chris, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. So certainly over the last month or two, the evidence would suggest that the peak in inflation, which we expect around April, is going to be higher than what was previously thought. So we're now looking at a peak at somewhere in the sort of mid 7% area for CPI. So that looks like where the peak will be. And then the expectation is that during the course of this year, calendar year, we'd be down to sort of 4.5% at the year end. But it's going to be well into 2023 calendar year before we get back down to the sort of 2.5% range that the Monetary Policy Committee like inflation to run at. And of course, at the moment, that high level of inflation or expected inflation is what's driving all the talk about higher base rates. So we've seen moves already, as Karen's alluded to, and we'll see several more moves during the course of this year. But obviously, with all the other headwinds and pressures that are out there, they've got a fine line to tread in terms of not putting them up so high that it hits the economy at a time when there's lots of other challenges as well. Obviously, the Ukraine situation that's come along provides a further uncertainty. So, you know, if that were to drag on, it could end up perhaps with a slightly different view being taken over time insofar as limiting base rate rises, but we'll have to wait and see on that. I mean, in terms of inflation coming down, you know, the reason we expect it to come down is that it's a year-on-year index. So we've had big increases go in over recent months. When you get to the corresponding month a year later, that increase falls out. So as long as it's not replaced by an equal or higher increase on that month, we should see a downward trajectory. But a lot of the inflation has come about from, you know, the economy reopening during last year, and not only higher commodity prices, but, you know, skill and labour shortages, which are feeding through to higher wage settlements, which again is starting to feed through into higher prices and costs being passed on. But as I say, so the outlook has changed a little in terms of a higher peak, and it taken a bit longer for it to come down to, I suppose, what we'd expect to be more typical levels.
Councillor Stringle, you wanted to come back.
Yeah, thank you for your answer, Chris and Karen. Just one brief question. Given the events on the world stage at the moment, and I noticed that the FTSE has dropped by 223 points at the moment, the Dow Jones is down. Will that have any impact you see or foresee if things continue the way they're going regarding markets are getting very nervous now about what's happening in the eastern part of Western Europe, if I can put it that way. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, what we tend to find is obviously whenever there's uncertainty, stock markets will react and will fall, often quite sharply as a near-term reaction. Obviously, it's early days, so we don't know whether that will continue. But what you tend to find is investors will move out of risky type assets such as equities, and they'll move into the sort of safe havens of gold and particularly high quality government bonds. So things like UK gilts. So we talk about interest rates, long-term interest rates could move a little bit higher. Often in these circumstances, a lot of money flooding into safe havens such as gilts can actually push the yields and the cost of borrowing down temporarily. So it's just that at the moment it'll be more about that flow of money out of riskier assets into safer ones.
I have actually checked this morning, and PWB rates have come off extensively this morning already. But it, like I say, it's a very volatile reaction to that. So how long that will last, it's uncertain. They have come off.
Thank you both.
Councillor Mrs. Brockway.
My question's already been answered, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs. Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really, I suppose I'm just linking back to what we were talking about before about enjoying life to the full. I think it's worth noting that a lot of the inflation is cost push pressures. So it's basically hitting necessity items like food, energy and fuel. So it's really hitting households directly. It's not something that is, in the atmosphere. It's hitting people's pockets, and wages are not keeping up. So people's living standards will fall. So I suppose I'm just hitting the point again about the council putting enjoying life to the full as an aspiration. I think, people's enjoying life to the full will not be felt if their economic conditions worsen.
No, I think we all see and appreciate the difficulties people face, and to a certain extent, unfortunately, it's beyond our control here, and by and large, it's actually beyond the government's control at the moment with things going on in the world. It's on that point, I've got a very brief question. How do we know, or do we have any data to assess or prove that the economic risk in terms of the lack of interest rates and the high CPI, that it's a transitory phenomenon and it's not a more permanent situation? Because if this becomes a more permanent situation, this could have serious implications, as has already been alluded to individual residents, to people we represent, but also to us as a corporate body, because obviously when you pay for things like road, steel, computer chips, whatever it may be, if this is a long-term phenomenon, we're going to have to do quite a serious, potentially, re-evaluation of what we can and can't afford to do.
I think just an overall comment in terms of inflation at the moment. I think it's too early to say whether we're in a situation where inflation is going to become ingrained in the economy and be more of a problem. I think 3-6 months time we'll have a better idea, because we would hopefully have gone past the peak that I referred to in April and start hopefully to see some evidence of inflation starting to come down. But it's going to be the policy makers, the Bank of England's role is to manage inflation at around 2%. So they're going to have to implement that policy to try and achieve that. But it's going to be a at the moment, certainly for the next 3 to 6 months, to see how things develop further. You know, it's not just a UK phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon, and, you know, the US, Eurozone economies are experiencing similar, if not higher, levels of inflation than we currently are.
Thank you for that. Yes, as you allude to, it's not just a UK phenomenon. I know the US is at about 7% now already. So
Yep.
we've got not just here, but obviously if trading partners have issues, then we have issues because we're so interconnected these days.
Yes, exactly. A global economy, so you know it's much more joined up than it used to be. But it means we get impacted by things further afield than we would have done as well.
Okay, not seeing any more speakers, so the actions required are that the board are to review the report, pass any comments to the Executive Council of Resources, Communications and Commissioning. I propose the board has received the report and is satisfied with the Treasury management activities and performance for quarter 3, and that our comments be passed on to the Executive Council of the Resources, Communications and Commissioning. Can I have a show of hands, please, for all those in favour? Thank you. Any against? And any abstentions? Seeing none for neither. That is unanimous. Thank you very much. And moving on to item 10. This item is pre-decision scrutiny prior to the decision by the Leader of the Council between the 14th and 18th of March 2022. Again, I'd like to invite Karen, Treasury Manager, to present this report, and also, as she's sorry I didn't welcome you earlier, Chris, welcome to you as well, Director of Link Asset Services, who's also in the attendance and here to answer our questions. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Chairman. This is the Treasury Management Strategy Statement, an annual investment strategy for 2022-23, and is due to be considered by the Executive Council for Resources and Communication on the 14th of March. I'll highlight the main points of the report, and then I will then ask Chris to comment on our strategy from a third-party point of view, if I may. So this strategy sets the framework for how the council manages its cash flows, borrowing, investments and risk. And the sums involved with Treasury are significant, and this can be seen in the table on page 107 of your pack, the Appendix A. And as shown with the previous paper just gone, that the performance against this strategy will be reported quarterly to this committee throughout the forthcoming year 2022-23. Please note that non-Treasury investments are made for service or commercial reasons, have a different risk profile to Treasury investments, and therefore they're not covered in these strategies. They're covered in the capital strategy, which is included in the council budget 22-23. So, as previously mentioned, CIPFA published a revised Treasury Management Code of Practice and a Prudential Code in December, and stated that formal adoption of these new codes was not required until 2023-24 financial year, given the late timing of the release. These codes form the cornerstone of the Treasury management function, and the council have adopted the policies within them in its financial regs. So I've outlined the main implications of the new codes on page 104 of the pack, just to give you some idea of what they are. And you'll see that the changes mainly revolve around setting new policy and practices for non-Treasury investments and commercial investments. It introduces a new skills and knowledge framework for individuals involved in the Treasury management function. So that's a framework we'll be developing throughout the year. New prudential indicators have been recommended to set proportionate approach to commercial and service investments again, and a new debt liability benchmark indicator for setting external borrowing and liquidity investment levels has been introduced. As I said, that the new requirement of the codes above will be developed throughout the year and reported on fully within the 2023-24 strategy and throughout next year, probably at the quarterly updates. An initial calculation of the debt liability benchmark has been included in this year's strategy as Annex E on page 139 of the pack. And I'll give an indication, it's really to give it an indication of what it will show. I'll comment on this in more detail when I get to the borrowing section of the strategy paper. So following the usual pattern, I've broken down this strategy into three main areas, familiar areas, which are interest rates and economy, borrowing and investments. So I'll go through and pick out the main points of each of these from the strategy. So starting with interest rates, the graph on page 108 of the report, I think, is it 168? The report shows the prospects for interest rates for 22-25 to 25 issued by Link Asset Services on the 7th of February, so for the fairly recent projection. The MPC started a series of expected increases in base rate on the 3rd of Feb and by increasing the base rate again by 0.25 to a level of 0.50%. Link expects further increases in rate in March, May and November of this financial year, and expects the level to end the financial year at 1.25% base rate. So that's quite high due to recent levels, but still not that high compared to history. But then, as we've hinted at, Link believe that this level will remain that way out to 2025, as the focus in supporting economic growth by the MPC will replace that of tackling inflation. So time will tell. And just to comment on long-term rates, they've been highly volatile since October 21, but have flattened out recently in times as shorter dated gilts have increased with the bank rate increases, and longer dated gilts have been pegged back with inflation concerns. So the result of this is really a flattened yield curve for borrowing out to 2025. And by that, I mean there's little difference in yield between 5-year and 50-year borrowing. So it's flattened, the difference between is flattened, and you can see that in the graphs supplied. A summary of the economic outlook really is that COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 on the economy appears to be subsiding, but predictions for growth have been reduced as consumers are taking a hit or will take a hit with real incomes by the inflation and tax increases that are due. Cpi inflation, as I've mentioned, is forecast to peak at 7.5% now in April. But once this is brought back, excuse me, target levels, there's expected to be a period of stagnation again for a considerable period. So we will see. And you can pick up a more detailed forecast of these interest rates and the economic outlook from Link in the Annex A of this report on page 125 and 127, which goes into a lot more depth on that. So turning to borrowing, the Council has a significant borrowing requirement over the next 3 years to finance its capital expenditure plans. And this can be seen in the table on page 110 of the pack. The affordability, prudence and sustainability of this borrowing is measured by the prudential indicators and limits that we set each year. And these can be seen in Annex C of the pack on 135, which shows all of the limits. One of the Prudential indicators is the new debt liability benchmark, and this, like I say, can be seen in Annex E of this pack on page 139. This benchmark focuses on what level of borrowing is required in order to keep investment at a level of around 100 million, which we've set initially as a suitable level to meet liquidity needs only. The graph in Annex E shows that the existing debt exceeds this debt liability benchmark already in both 2021 and 2022-23. You can see this by the red box that I've outlined on that graph. And this is at a given level investment of 100 million. And so this indicates initially that no external borrowing will be required in these years, which should bring our cash balances down to the 100 million level. And this is how the debt liability benchmark is working. We're already not borrowing anything in 2021. We've decided that from the previous paper. But this is indicating that we've no need to borrow anything either in 2022-23. This approach focuses on the level of cash balance for the liquidity cash flow, and hence what external borrowing is required to achieve this, rather than what we've been doing in the past of focusing on what internal borrowing level is required from the borrowing requirement and what that impact on the cash balance will be. So it's just a different focus on what we're focusing at. But work will be done during the year to refine this benchmark, especially in the area of cash flow and reserves and level of liquidity, because this is what this indicator is focusing on. So we've got to some more work to do to make sure we're getting that right if we're going to follow this indicator. And I thought it was useful just to show you what it's it's like at the moment. What it's showing us. The Council's MRP policy is covered in Annex D on page 137 of the pack. And this details how the Council will set aside cash resource from revenue each year to repay borrowing. The MRP level is a Prudential indicator and is shown in the table on page 112. And this hasn't, the policy on this hasn't changed. So that's an indication of our MRP. And the borrowing strategy for 22-23, taking into account all these factors, is highlighted in the table on 2.3.6 on page 116 of the pack. So that's borrowing. I'll turn quickly to investments. The cash balances are forecast to be around 250 million, and this is net of pension fund cash that we pool with our balances of 60 million for 22-23. 150 million of this can be defined as core balances available to invest for longer periods of investment. It's worth noting if no external borrowing is undertaken in 22-23, in line with the new debt liability benchmark, then we should see this level of investments dropping to the cash flow driven level of around 100 million. So that's how it's going to work. The strategy for investments is outlined in 2.4.6 on page 119, 120 of the pack. And I'll just point out that the Council's risk appetite for Treasury investments remains low, and its priorities still remain as security first, liquidity second, and then yield. We have set a limit again of 40 million for any investment made over 1 year. But as I said, in an increasing rate environment, lending for a longer period isn't really the way to go. So we shouldn't envisage that will be a problem this year. There will be a review of enhanced money market funds during 22-23. This review has been brought forward from the previous year, which we didn't manage to undertake. These funds offer slightly higher yields than existing funds, but have different risk parameters. So we'll be looking to see whether we can utilise any of those and still meet our liquidity needs. Excuse me. I'd like to point out one difference in the strategy this year, and that's the investment benchmark for 22-23. This has changed, and it will be the Sterling Overnight Index Average going forward, or what's called the SONIA rate. Now, this rate has replaced LIBOR and LIBID reference rate that ceased on the 31st of December 2021. It's SONIA is a risk-free rate for sterling markets administered by the Bank of England, and it represents the overnight rate that banks will lend to each other during sterling clearing operations on a daily basis. The rate is relative and moves with the market, but unfortunately it's not representative of what general market participants can achieve, such as the council, in terms of size and yield and counterparties. It's also just an average rate with no bid-offer spread. So it's worth noting that the LIBOR-LIBID spread was around 0.12%, so it's quite significant. So we haven't really got an alternative since LIBOR ceased, but so some adjustments to the SONIA rate are going to be required to make this into a relevant, achievable benchmark to use. So the initial benchmark yield used is going to be SONIA less 0.1% to see how this looks. But further work will be undertaken throughout the year with the help of Link to refine this benchmark throughout the year and then see how it's looking. And finally, just point out that the annual investment strategy for 22-23 is outlined in Annex F of page 141 of the report. There's been no change to this strategy from the previous year. It still holds the same risk profile, but you can see it there as Annex F. So that's all from me. So I'd just quickly like to ask Chris to comment on this strategy in terms of the third party point of view and compare it to their other clients, and then be happy to take questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Karen. I mean, with all strategies, it's something that's sort of unique to your organisation. So it's about what's appropriate to yourselves based on your future plans and obviously all the external influences there are. So it's about you as a council rather than doing the same as everybody else and coming up with a strategy that's appropriate and workable on that basis. I mean, breaking down the individual parts of it in terms of the borrowing side of things. For many years now, the councils have adopted a policy of being internally borrowed, i.e. running down cash instead of externally borrowing. And obviously that's worked well and been very cost effective, and that's something that should be continuing in the future. So that policy of maintaining an internal borrowing position, and in fact that going up, makes sense, and it's also in tune with the what Karen said about the liability benchmark that's going to be introduced. Obviously we'll be working further on that to refine things and make sure it's as meaningful as possible. So again, what's been done in the past is actually in tune with what you're now being asked to do. So obviously that's a big tick in the box. So continuing internal borrowing rather than external borrowing is going to continue to be a cost-effective way forward. With the interest rate outlook, I mean, we've talked about higher interest rates. I mean, what markets do is they will factor in rises in advance of them actually happening. So in terms of the rates we have currently enforced, actually they do factor in quite a lot of what will happen in the future. So if we get further base rate rises, they're expected anyway. So we wouldn't expect to see a huge change to rates from where they are now, certainly the long-term rates, because as I say, markets will factor those rate rises in. So again, an appropriate position to be in. Looking at investments, I mean, like most councils, you've been running with much higher investment levels than typically you have in the past. Obviously COVID's played a part part in that, but also delays to capital programmes as well have meant that money isn't going out the door as quickly as it perhaps might. So you've still got 350 million-ish of cash being invested. The expectation is that will come down if you don't externally borrow. You obviously set a policy around managing that cash in terms of who you can invest with and for how long, and various other parameters. I'd certainly say that that's the strategy and the parameters are appropriate based on where we are at the moment. We follow our methodology, but then have some slightly more stringent controls over and above that, which again are appropriate. Obviously, minimise the risks to do with investments. So again, leaving those as they were compared to the previous year makes sense, but at the same time, those parameters will allow you to invest your cash safely and over time as base rates rise. Then, as Karen said, by keeping the portfolio of shorter duration, it just means you've got more opportunities to lock into these better rates as they start to appear during the course of the year. So you should start to experience a reasonable pickup in investment income. No pressure, Karen. Steadily during the course of the year. So as existing investments mature, then if they're reinvested, they'll be at higher rates than what you're currently experiencing. So should see an improvement there. But overall, the framework that you've got there to manage that cash is safe and sensible based on where we are at the moment. Karen's also touched on benchmarks. Again, the SONIA rate has replaced the LIBID and LIBOR rates, so we put something together initially, which we'll need to keep under review, i.e. compare actual performance and rates achieved by the council against these market rates. It's very much early days on that, so again, it could be something that's subject to change and refinement, during the course of the year if we think that's going to be appropriate. So I think overall, the strategy makes sense based on the factors that are known to us, based on the interest rate environment as well, and obviously the council's future plans going forward. As has been alluded to in the report at the beginning, there are a number of changes that will need to be implemented in next year's strategy, so 2023-24. But obviously we'll be working with officers to make implementation of that as easy as possible, and obviously our sort of reports and templates will obviously incorporate the requirements of the code to ensure that you're complying with best practice. So that's probably all I wanted to say, but I've sort of tried to cover the relevant areas.
Thank you very much. Councillor Stringle, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Karen, for a very in-depth report and for struggling through with the cold as well. So hats off to you there, and thank you, Chris, as well. You mentioned that you don't intend borrowing even in the short term over this year and possibly next year. It does mention, and I can understand the need to maintain liquidity, but you also mentioned that temporary short-term borrowing will be taken instead of drawing down on investments, and I fully understand that obviously that's when it's cheaper to do so, to minimise the loss of interest. Obviously, interest rates are minuscule at the moment anyway. There must be a fine line when you tip that balance and you need to now start drawing down from funds such as deposit accounts, etc., to maintain liquidity. So do you foresee that fine line, if I can use the word, being breached any time soon? Thank you.
Yeah, interestingly, that gets easier in an increasing interest rate environment. Actually, it's harder when rates are falling to maintain that line. But the average cost of that temporary borrowing was 0.04 and that our current money market fund level was 0.07, I think, on the Q3 report. So as long as it's it's below that, then that's fine. But obviously, as the interest rates are increasing, the money market fund rates go up with that. And today's sort of money market fund level is 0.31. So that borrowing that we've taken is ultra cheap now in compared to today's levels. So like I say, it's easier in that respect when rates are going up. But on the flip side of that, it's harder to maintain the benchmark on investments when rates are going up as well, because you've always got this time lag of when your investments haven't matured yet to replace them with current levels. So it's swings and roundabouts on that.
Thank you.
Councillor Mrs Brockway.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got questions on page 103, 104 and 105, which is very handy because you don't have to jump around. If you look on 103 at the bullet points, the batch of bullet points at the bottom, I've got some concern about the way the CPI code has been worded, if this is the actual wording of the code. In the first bullet point, it says attribute all investments and investment income to one of the following three purposes: treasury management, service delivery and commercial return. Now, these are not purposes. Service delivery is a purpose, but a purpose is the reason for which something is done. And you don't do attribute income. Treasury management is a function, and so is commercial return, to service the service delivery. So to call them purposes in their own right worries me because it's putting them on, giving them a status or a pinnacle, which actually they shouldn't have, because they are functions of the service delivery, which really is the only purpose there, as far as I can see. Tell me that I'm wrong, but give me a reason for that, please. That sort of wording, I think it's subtle, but I think you have to get it right when you're talking about the investment practices of the council. So if I'm wrong, fine. So that's my first comment. Shall I do all three as before, Chairman?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. The second one is on the next page, page 104, which is the last bullet point at the top. It's just a query, really. I understand why you would need to amend the Knowledge and Skills Register for financial functions, but I'd like to have some idea of how well placed we are with that. Are we going to be okay with that, basically? So that's my question there. My last question is on 105, which is 1.6 to do with the pension fund cash. It makes clear that the pension fund cash can be pooled with surplus council cash for investment in a number of ways, actually. So what I'd like to know is what protection is there for the separateness and protection of the pension fund within that context, please. So the protection of the pension fund, how are we placed for the skills register and the wording of purposes as opposed to functions? I think that wording is important, actually, because it really does attribute a different status to those 3 points there. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. That wording, Councillor Brockway, is my wording.
Oh, sorry,
really.
sorry.
Not CIPFA's, but what it was hinting at is that within the code, CIPFA has reclassified investments into those three different areas, and treasury management investments are the ones that I'm reporting on today. That's the ones, the investments that I can make from the cash balance of the council under a treasury management remit. But they've classified other investments, the non-treasury investments, into these two distinct areas now. One being investments made with the aim of service delivery. So there's a service reason behind an investment that you've made, and that can include loaning to a third party to deliver that service and so forth. And the other category is just for commercial return. So investments made just to make a return with no service delivery benefit behind them. And so this is really following on from SIPRA's remit for the new codes. Really is to sort of tackle the policy and practices of all these non-treasury and commercial investments that have arisen over the last several years. So hopefully that will explain that a bit better. It's really the three different classifications of investments we'll have going forward, and we're going to be reporting on those separately and as well. The other question about knowledge and skills, this is another requirement of the code. We don't have a knowledge and skills register at the present. We just have a remit to be properly trained for those involved in treasury management, and we've actually stated that training policy in the strategy somewhere. It's below there at 1.4 on page 104 actually. So we already recognise that we've got to be suitably trained and report on that, but the skills and knowledge register takes that further, and I think it wants to introduce a framework where we state what knowledge and skills each participant should really have in the area, and if that's lacking, then what training can be given to provide that. And this is really, as it says there, it's going to be proportionate to the size and complexity of each council as well, because each council's setup is different in the way it delivers treasury management, and small councils haven't got a separate area for this and so forth, and so it's going to be really up to us as the council to develop this suitable for our council, and then just highlight what level of skill we're expecting from each participant, and what training it will be available to meet that level of skill. And the next, the final point about pension fund cash, this pooling arrangement has been on the go for a long time, and to protect the pension fund, we do have an agreement in place, which is mentioned there, that sort of was set up in April 2010 to govern the protection and how that pooling arrangement is going to work in terms of what return the pension fund gets on the cash, and what can they be drawn for if things default and that sort of thing. But it's all governed in an agreement that we've got that was set in place there, and it just involves day-to-day council balances of the pension fund, but it also in recent times includes any strategic asset allocation for cash that they've got, and that's prevalent at the moment, because their level of cash that's within ours is around 60 million now, and about 50 million of that is asset allocation cash at this point in time. But it is governed by an agreement which gives protection on both sides.
I've got a few questions, if I may. What impact will the new prudential indicator for indebtedness have on the county council? Do you suspect this will be a negative one, as I know county councils were quite strong in their concern around this, around the SIPRA code when it was being considered and being consulted on. Next question, I suppose you may be quite hard to answer, but we've already touched on Ukraine and what impact that could have. But what members and officers might not be aware is that China have also gone into the South China Sea around Taiwan as well this morning, according to a report I saw earlier. What impact, if any, will that have more to us as a council rather than nationally? But it will obviously have a national impact, but what impact do you think that could have to us as an authority financially? And finally, this one should be a lot easier to answer. Do you believe the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England will raise interest rates faster if they do not bring inflation down in the manner that they are hoping to with the current rise? Thank you.
you want me to take the last one, Karen? Last one first, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you can do, Chris, yeah.
Okay, I mean, obviously, as I said earlier, the risks around inflation aren't still fully known. As I say, our best estimate is a peak in April and then a reduction gradually during the course of this year and into probably the back end of next calendar year before we get back to where we are. I mean, obviously, if inflation is more ingrained, in theory, you'd expect several more rate rises above what we've currently got. So that may take us to the 2% level. But again, as we've alluded, that there's a balancing act here, just in terms of not choking off economic growth and inflicting, further pain on businesses and individuals during what's already going to be a very difficult year or two to be dealt with. But there is a risk if inflation is ingrained. Well, it's bad anyway. That we may need rates to go up a little bit higher and for a little bit longer. I mean, in terms of impact for the council of that, I mean, higher interest rates. Well, that mean better investment returns, so more investment income. Obviously, if you were to externally borrow, then obviously it may mean that it's a little bit more expensive than we're perhaps predicting. But very often, one will tend to offset the other.
And thank you, Chris. And if I can comment on the impact to the council with the recent activities in Russia and Ukraine, I think we've alluded to it. I mean, that the initial shocks in the market will be, the equities will fall, and also borrowing will come off initially. So that will mean cheaper borrowing costs. But I don't know if that will increase short-term rates. Chris might like to comment on that at all.
I mean, sorry. Yes, I mean, uncertainty tends to mean, drop off in risky assets such as equities, money moved into safe havens such as, high quality government bonds in safe places such as the UK, US, etc. And things like gold traditionally tend to find inflows of cash in uncertain times. So if you've got, the Ukraine situation, then other flashpoints, other issues in other geographic areas, again, it's just further uncertainty, which potentially means if it's prolonged, negative impact on economic growth, which therefore may mean that rates don't need to go up, don't go up in reality because of it. So it's going to be a very fluid situation, but it's really early days on that.
And I guess the impact on gas for the region, it might increase fuel costs even more, so that will have an impact on inflation maybe, prolong that perhaps, but we'll have to see. And in terms of the impact on the liability benchmark, it's just as I indicated in the report, that the idea of that is to bring your cash in liquidity, your cash level down to your liquidity requirement. And hence, by doing that, you actually bring your borrowing level down as well at the same time. So that's the impact really that will have in the long term. It is to sort of have less of each. To be honest, less borrowing and less investments, and those investments are just for liquidity. So that's how I envisage that looking in the future.
Thank you both for answering those questions. If there's any other questions, and I'm not seeing any, in which case we shall move to the actions required, which are: consider the attached report and to determine whether the board supports the recommendation to the Leader of the Council, Executive Councillor for Resources, Communications and Commissioning as set out in the report. 2, agree any additional comments to be passed on to the Leader of the Council in relation to this item. Can I have a proposer and seconder to support the paper and that any comments be passed. Thank you, Councillor Wootton, Councillor Stringle. All those in favour, please show. Any against? Any abstentions? That's unanimous. Thank you. Moving on, when I can get the paper. Item 11. This item is pre-decision scrutiny prior to a decision by the Executive on the 1st of March 2022. I would like to invite Andrew Crookham, excuse me, let me get teeth in, Executive Director of Resources, to present the report, and also welcome the Heads of Finance, Pam Clipsome and Sue Maycop, Keith Noiland and Mark Popwell, who are attending in the Council Chamber and also via Teams to help answer any questions. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Very happy to be presenting the Q3 revenue position to you today, as you say, before it goes on to Executive next week. Relatively modest net improvement from the position reported at Q2, around about £1.5 million, albeit there are quite a few variances in moving to that position. I'll cover those briefly. As you'll see from the paper, we're reporting quite an increased movement in the home to school transport budget. And indeed, obviously, members approved the 22-23 budget last Friday at Council, which brought some of these issues out. I think, as you'd appreciate, as we move, particularly during the period that this report covers, it's very much the business end of the budget setting process, and clearly that's where we smoke out a lot of the pressures as we move into the new year, and indeed sort of potential underspends as well, particularly around things like our contingencies, which are also set out in the paper. I think it's also important to note that that 7.3 million underspend is it's not quite a gross position, albeit we've referred in previous meetings in this chamber around the domestic abuse grant, which would be requesting a transfer to reserves from members in September as part of the year-end process. And I think just before I wrap up, as I say, it's a very, very brief update. I think the only other thing to note in terms of, obviously, Councillor Wootton referred earlier about the end of the COVID. I think it's important to note that we've obviously incurred a further £80 million of expenditure related to COVID-related activities this year. And indeed, coming to this underspend position, and as the leader referred to in some of his response to the debate last Friday, obviously we've continued to judiciously code expenditure where possible to those COVID grants to protect the local taxpayer funding, I guess. So that's my update. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Councillor Zilkshire, you had a question.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Mr. Crookham, for the report. I've got to say, first of all, I recognise the healthy position, in the last item that we're able to discuss management and what to do with 250 million of cash balances the council has. I also welcome the healthy reserves that we've heard today are not likely to be called on in the coming year, I should say. And I recognise that the 7.3 million forecast underspend on the budget on a budget of circa 500 million, is an achievement in budget control and management. The 7.3 million forecast is obviously less than last year's underspend, which I think was in the order of about 25 million. Please correct me if I'm wrong. There's something in that order. I just wonder if you could remind us what we did with last year's underspend. I seem to recall 10 million went into that we all supported, and I certainly did, into highways for the shortfall as a result of the loss of the 12 point whatever million grant it was from the government. Can I ask, has that £10 million that went in been spent, or is it likely to be spent by the end of the year? I think I heard you say that we'll be looking. Obviously, the 7.3 million is not gross, but I think you said that when we get there, we would look to transfer whatever the underspend is into reserves in September. I note that general reserves are currently 16.2 million or thereabouts, which represents just over 3% of the target is 2.5 to 3.5. That's a SIPA figure, I presume, is it? And it's just over 3% currently. What will it be if we were in the happy position of being able to put 7 million extra into reserves, having not, touched them up to that point, it will presumably take it over, even, on the general reserves. But then I notice, of course, that we have a financial volatility reserve of 44 million or thereabouts, which added together, gives us the 60 million of, I use the term, I'm not an accountant, cash reserves, if I might use that term, which would actually, when we put those two together, comes to well over 10% in my book. You'd probably get a more accurate figure. So my question on that is, when was the financial volatility reserve established? And how different is that to the what we call general reserves? And, not to put too fine a point on it, why is the financial volatility reserve not counted within the 2.5% to 3.5% target for our reserves? I accept we're in a healthy position. I'm not, criticising that in any way. I'm just asking those questions. Thank you.
Yeah, Andrew.
Thank you, Councillor Dilks. Thank you, Councillor Smith. There was quite a bit in there, so I'll try and cover them. If I do miss anything, please do correct me, and I'll try and come back on them. So the way we report the year-end underspends, we tend to report the school's carry forward balance as well as the council's general fund balance underspend. And what we did at year-end last year, there was a few components of what council agreed for the use of that underspend. There was, as you rightly say, there was a £10 million addition to highways, and you rightly identify we won't spend all of that this year. The expenditure is to be spent over a period of about 3 years on particular initiatives. So that might be around rural roads, but also as well around some specifics around drainage and gully type work. There was a further amount allocated towards coronavirus costs, which was about £2.3 million, and the budget that was set last Friday released that back. In my presentation, I referred to us judiciously coding expenditure to coronavirus, and as the years progressed since Council accepted that recommendation, some of the grant conditions that have been provided by government have been relaxed to allow us to carry forward grants or to continue to receive them, I guess, as it's proceeded. So we've been able to do that. So therefore, we've taken the view that we don't need that £2.3 million reserve, and that indeed has gone in terms of, I guess, backfilling the highways £12 million for the 22-23 budget. And then there was a further amount on top of that related to the automatic, which is set out in the council's constitution, the automatic 1% carry forwards of underspends that services can use, and those reasons will be littered throughout the directorate commentaries. In terms of this year-end position, obviously we're reporting a £7.3 million underspend at the moment, and about £900,000 of that would be asking council to transfer to a reserve so it can be used to spend on domestic abuse activities in future years. And we've said in this committee previously that guidance on the domestic abuse, the new domestic abuse agenda was late. We've only relatively recently agreed our strategy on that as a council, and that we'd be able to obviously essentially play catch up in future years with expenditure in that area. That leaves about £6 million. I don't know what the exact maths is, but again, some of that will trigger the automatic 1% carry forwards for directorates that have underspent, and then there will be an amount that is left. Now, that is a political decision on what that's used for. Naturally, we'd make officer recommendations to the executive on what that might be, albeit is then the executive's purview to then make a recommendation to council on what it wants to do. And clearly, relatively new in a new administration, there are a lot of priorities that need identification and investment in. So that's for a later day essentially, but it's not, as it stands based on the figures, it's not going to be a significant sum. You mentioned about reserves, so the general reserve for the council, the 2.5% to 3.5%, the actual percentage that we recommend and that I recommend to the council as a Section 151 officer is a professional opinion. It's not set out anywhere, and there's no sort of recommendations for anyone, unlike SIPFA or the government, on what that level should be. Albeit that the level of that reserve has been council policy that way predates my time, but I agree with the rationale and what it's spent upon. All councils have to have one. If you don't have one, obviously we'd receive a report from the auditors in the first instance to say that we did need one because there's a legal requirement for it. But the actual reason for having that reserve is the ultimate backstop. It's for events that may occur that no other contingencies that you've set in your budget can cover. So that, if we establish that as the principle of that one, the actual financial volatility reserve then is at the discretion of the council. And it was set up, I think, somewhere around about 2012. I may be right, but I may be wrong with that, but it was around about that period. And this was coming around the period of the extreme cuts that we had at the start of that decade, which are well rehearsed. But then has been built over a period of years from those discretionary elements of the underspend that the councils had during that period of time to the current level that it is at the moment, which is the £44 million. Now, as we've progressed through that austerity decade, if you will, you know, a lot of the high-level savings that were taken very early on were quite easy to take out. Obviously, we've radically changed the way we operate as a council. But what that has meant is that any savings that we would ultimately be able to take now would naturally take more pain, they'd take more time, and to make the change, I guess, to leave any change that the council would have with an effective organisation would take time to do. And when I set out my advice in the budget report to councillors around that, I say that good change, and it comes with experience. And you know, James and I, both of us in our roles that we've had, not just here but in other councils, you'll see that a good change cycle to make something sustainable is 2 to 3 years. And sat alongside that, we know that we've been having the fair funding review. The fair funding review has been coming for a number of years now. I think I joked in a previous session, it might have been in one of the training sessions actually, but you know, I've had 2 children since the fair funding review was announced, and one of them's in school now, so it's a decent amount of time. And we are still waiting. We are expecting it this year, but the main premise of holding that balance now is around giving us a cushion if the fair funding review goes against us. And I've well rehearsed in this chamber around the challenges that the government's going to face around squaring off deprivation and rurality. You know, they're the 2 key factors in play, really. If the fair funding review goes against us and we are required to fundamentally change the way that the organisation is shaped, that £44 million isn't going to last very long in terms of managing those cuts. Alongside that, the budget that was set last Friday, albeit it is a 1-year budget, the future year forecasts do, and we acknowledged that in the chamber last Friday, the future year forecasts do currently suggest that we would need to halve that reserve in doing so, unless further actions were taken. So I hope that answers your question, and I covered all the points, but...
Yeah, please, if you need to.
Yes, thank you for the answer. I did want to ask one detail on that. Is last year, just from memory, and I wasn't able to sort of find it in any papers, but did we, as part of the underspend, spend or allocate 9 or 10 million to business grants because of COVID? I seem to recall that was, please correct me if I'm wrong. I hear your answer, but it would be fair, wouldn't it, or tell me if I'm wrong, to put, if we put the general reserves with the financial volatility reserves, our cash reserves are well over 10% of annual budget.
Yeah, you're right, Councillor Dilks. Obviously, the council made a decision at last February's council meeting as part of the budget to allocate £10 million. Around about that related to the highways gap, and then re-topped it up again at the year end. So you're correct about that. So I'll go back to my original comments. So I see the general reserve is a requirement that we are required to have legally. The financial volatility reserve is an earmarked reserve, of which we've got a number of other ones which we talked about, which we set out in the budget papers, and is a different thing. So I guess you could set that argument to all of the other earmarked reserves that we have, albeit we acknowledge that they're all set aside for specific use. So I do think it's important to see them as two different entities, albeit we have said that the council is willing to use that volatility reserve to manage future funding volatility, whereas the general reserve is there as an ultimate backstop. So they have got different usages and needs, I guess.
Thank you for that. I do understand, but I do find it's kind of perhaps confusing to a non-accountant like me, when you see this statement that our reserves are between 2.5% and 3.5%, when we don't put that context in of what also is there in other reserves, if I can put it that way. It's just a sort of perhaps it might be worth thinking about in future, but thank you.
Councillor Mrs Brockway.
No, sorry, I said what I said earlier.
Oh.
Sorry, I apologise.
Mrs Councillor Keeley.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Just following on from what Councillor Dilk said, could you just clarify whether when the fairer funding review is being done, whether they take into account the amount of reserves that we've got and decide that Lincolnshire County Council are doing quite well anyway and don't need any more funding? I don't understand whether this might be counting against us.
Please, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So we're given to understand that the review will be commencing in the spring. So I think it's a fair question to ask about resources and what have you. But the main essence of the review is around needs, which is why I talked about deprivation and rurality as an example earlier. The need to spend money on adult care, the need to spend money on children's care, the need to spend money on leisure if you're a lower tier or authority or a unitary, for example. All of those sort of things, rather than what you've specifically got on your balance sheet now. I think it's important to note for this chamber, I think, that obviously reserve, and it's a well-rehearsed argument, it came out on Friday as well, those reserves are only there to be used once. I think the council has its own right to set aside its reserves to use for purposes that it thinks is necessary, and they shouldn't form part of a fair funding review, because I think it's technically an irrelevance to that debate, because this is all about need to spend, what you're spending your funding on, and your ability to raise taxation locally, what have you, all of that sort of thing. And nowhere in any of the pre-work that's been done, because there was a period of time around about 2017, 2018, where a lot of workshop work was done across the sector around cost drivers, around, as I say, service needs, what have you, and council reserves didn't come up in any of that work, and I wouldn't expect it to come up in the work that's going to be undertaken in the spring either.
Thank you for the answer, Andrew, and detailed answers. I've hopefully got some easier questions for you to answer, but I can't.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
is it possible for me to make some comments on the political side of this?
Yes, please.
On behalf of Councillor Hill and myself, I think the issue is, I think as Andrew has just explained, the general reserve, the sort of £16 million there is, as Andrew said, the reserve of last resort. So it's sort of what you go to if, I mean, for instance, we had a COVID pandemic. Now, the government did make a lot of money available to us at that stage, £100 million. Potentially, and I think that highlights the fact that you never quite know what's around the corner. And if we had any sort of particular events going forward where we had to call upon that reserve, the reality is at 3%, it's about just under 3 weeks worth of spending, for this council. So in that context, it is quite a small amount. The reserve going forward, the underspend this year, as Andrew's indicated, will be probably just shy of 7%. Sorry, so just shy of 7 million. And it's historically, this council has always allowed those sort of underspending departments to carry forward any underspends up to 1%. The value of our 7 million is about 1%. So certainly a lot of those underspends that potentially will go back to service areas. The financial volatility reserve in my time has kind of varied between what it is now and about 55, 56 million pounds over time. It's gone up and it's gone down really over the last sort of six to 7 years. And I think, as Andrew's indicated, it's there really to cover off a lot of the financial uncertainties that we potentially got at the moment. And Andrew's mentioned fairer funding, which has sort of been on the cards for probably 7-8 years now. There's also some uncertainties around around business rates retention, potentially what that might mean. More recent times, we've got the adult social care reforms that are potentially coming along as well. Now, we know already from work that the adult social care team have done that the number of financial assessments that we do, which are currently 10,000, are likely to increase to 20,000. So there's likely to be potentially a lot more people requiring services from the council. So I think in that context, when you actually look at that financial volatility reserve, and I think as the point I made in my last Friday, was that 44 million, if we don't do anything else as we currently stand, 22 million of that will be required really mainly to plug the gap in the highways funding that we've got. So potentially it doesn't take very much for that level of actual reserves to be depleted. You know, we live in also, as well as this, we also know that we're living in inflationary times. Potentially, I just noticed this morning, following on from what's going on in Eastern Europe, that the price of crude oil has leapt by 8% overnight as well. So at some point that will work through, and we've already discussed it previously in this meeting, all the inflationary pressures in the economy. So at the end of the day, yes, it's great to have reserves. And if you look at it in pure terms, they are just over, if you add the financial volatility reserve and the general reserve together, they are just over 10%. But there's a lot of financial risk currently out there in the wider system and also locally within LCC. So I think it's the view of the executive that the level of resources that we've got, and this is been based on taking advice from officers, is prudent and is at a level that hopefully should allow us to deal with a lot of this financial risk, potential financial volatility and uncertainty. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Not a problem, Councillor Whittington. Not a problem. In fact, that was very helpful to give that explanation, following on from Andrew's very helpful explanation as well. Hopefully, as I said, my question should be easier for you to answer, Andrew. Does the council believe that it will still have to fund scaled back programmes in relation to the COVID-19 intervention after government grant ends, or it will still have debt to pay from that, which I know or the debt that's forecast will have to pay back from that will exponentially increase at all? If the answer is yes to that, is the projected risk to the council finances across specific departments, directories and infrastructure projects? Sorry, what is the projected risk to the council finances across specific departments, directories and infrastructure projects and block programmes?
Thank you, Councillor Smith. So, I think the first one part of my question to Councillor Dilks covers it. So, in terms of the broad general sense, I think we wouldn't have recommended giving up that £2.3 million general COVID reserve that we'd set up at year-end last year without a sense that we didn't have things covered. Particularly the budget that the council set last Friday acknowledges some of those after effects of COVID spend, and we talked about looked after children numbers earlier as a particular issue with that, and we know that we'll be carrying as a minimum about £6 million of costs over the next 3 years related to that, but that's been built into the budget rather than relying on grant funding that doesn't necessarily exist at the moment, because that wouldn't be a sensible approach. We know that some of the grants that we've received related to particularly the adult care field, so whether that's outbreak management or what have you, can be carried forward, or any rump spend can be carried forward further. Pam Clipson's on the line. She might want to add to that, because when you talk about specific areas where there'll be after effects, and it is a complicated picture, because we've had 2 years of paused public health programmes whilst health protection measures have been put in place, and there's almost, they said there's almost 2 years of activity that's been paused there whilst those teams have been working excellently and hard on supporting everything in Lincolnshire that's been going related to that. But it does go beyond that as well. So if Pam is there, she might want to add some context to that. But that's the main area.
Yeah, thank you. Over to you, Pam, if you've got anything you wish to add from Andrew's comments.
Hi, yes, thank you, Chair. The adult care medium-term financial plan that we have within the Directorate now identifies the ongoing costs that we have, in particular around COVID-19. As Andrew's rightly said, we have a delay in services. So services like our health checks that were reduced, stood down as a result of the supporting the vaccine rollout programme. We are expecting that activity to bounce back in 22-23, and we also have quite a number of adult specialties, or adults in particular, whose care packages, as a result of isolation and services that weren't able to run through pandemic and the restrictions that were put in place, have needed additional packages of care, particularly one-to-one hours, that we can't just remove overnight. So we are continually with our frontline services reviewing those service users, but we envisage that will take quite a way into 22-23. They are funded through the grants that Andrew referred to, predominantly the outbreak management, which we received confirmation in January that we can carry forward to support those costs. So they are built into Adult Care's financial position and the medium-term financial plan that was included in the budget that was signed off last week.
Thank you for that clarification. Councillor Dilks, you wanted to come back briefly.
Very kind to allow me to come back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hear all the comments about reserves and why we need them, and I appreciate, of course, that you can only use them once. However, it is a fact, as was alluded, and I don't want to go back to the budget debate, but other colleagues have mentioned it. There is a fact that, as the leader of this council said last week, the government ignored the campaign by this council to win back the 12 million highway shortfall that was taken last year by the government. And whilst we've had the debate here, there is a perception clearly at Westminster, and alluded to by my MP. I've had the conversation with him, Sir John Hayes, and I asked him why, they'd taken this money away from Lincolnshire for highways. And he said to me quite straightly, he said, we, the government, have given Lincolnshire record amounts for highways over the years. And if they want to spend more, they have got extremely healthy reserves, and they should be using those reserves. Now, so perhaps it's a conversation that needs to be had, in another place. But thank you.
I'll touch on that briefly. That is a conversation that's been being had, and that comment wasn't just raised by you; it was raised by somebody else. To which I won't name the other individual MP that said it, but they were quite forceful in what their reply to that was, which was that it wasn't an appropriate thing to say, and actually doesn't understand the reality of how things function in the council and the other pressures we're under. I won't go into it any more than that for obvious reasons, but I thought it was important to allude to that. Not seeing any further speakers, we'll go to the actions required, which is to consider the attached report to determine whether the board supports the recommendation to the executive as set out in the report, agree any additional comments to be passed on to the executive in relation to this item. The recommendation to the executive is set out on page 153 and is as follows. The executive, is it? Oh, wait, that's right, that's not relevant to us. Right, all in favour of the recommendations on in our report, please show. Any against? And any abstentions? One abstention. Thank you. Moving on to item 12, Capital Monitoring Report 21 to 22, quarter 3 to the 31st of December. The item is for pre-decision scrutiny prior to the executive on the 1st of March 22. Again, I'd like to invite Andrew to present the report. And again, we have Pam Clipson online and Sue Makercock in the chamber, Keith Neuland and Mark Popwell in attendance via Teams again as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. Yeah, so this is the briefest of briefest updates really with this particular paper. Clearly, the capital programme covers a 10-year period, and again, members have made amendments to that longer-term capital budget at Council last Friday. I think the main point to note on this particular paper is the change in that forecasted in-year underspend this year. This is that being 21-22. We're reporting something around the region of about £40 million underspent in year at quarter 2, and we've been through a serious rephasing exercise, and that has moved the costs related to Spalding Western Relief Road predominantly into 22-23. Hence that position appearing to move quite markedly. But there's nothing significant to report other than that. And clearly, as I said, with the revenue paper, we've got a lot more clarity on the block budget position that again is reported elsewhere in the paper. So again, happy to take any questions that members may have.
Any questions from anybody at all? Because I'm not seeing. Well, this could be very quick because I'm not seeing any, and I haven't got any either. So the actions are as follows: to consider the attached report and determine whether the board supports the recommendation to the executive as set out in the report and agreed any additional comments. Well, there are no additional comments. All in favour of recommendation 1, please show. Any against? Any abstentions? That is unanimous. Moving on to item 13, Scrutiny Work Programme. This item provides an update to the work of the Environment and Economic Scrutiny Committee and the Highways and Transport Scrutiny Committee. I'd like to invite Councillor O'Wootton, Chairman of the Environment and Economic Scrutiny Committee, and Councillor Alex Hall, Vice Chairman of Highways and Transport Scrutiny Committee, to present their updates. Firstly, over to Councillor Wootton.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I see time's moving on, so I'll try and be brief. Before I start my report, may I thank Kiera from Democratic Services for her support during the committee, and also place on record my thanks to Emily Wilcox for her support. She's been really excellent throughout the time that she's been with us, and she's been replaced by Tom Croft, which I welcomed to our committee the other day. Mr. Chairman, you have before you a detailed account of items already taken in the meetings that have been taking place since our last update at this board in November 21. On pages 224 to 228, members were provided with an overview of the items presented at the last 2 meetings. This included our approval of the Council Budget Report for 22-23. That was further approved at full Council on the 18th of this month. As part of this, we acknowledged the importance of efforts made to roll out efficient waste collection services, including the separate paper and cardboard collection trial and the food waste collection trial that took place in South Holland and South Castilian, and welcome future plans for further wide rollout of the food waste collection, appreciating that these were affected and shaped by the implementation of the Environment Act 22, in which food waste collection would be mandatory. In line with the latter, we requested that a future report regarding monitoring the recycling and food waste collection across the county be added to the committee's work programme. Moving on, the committee met on the 22nd of this month and reviewed the quarterly performance indicators for economy, flooding and waste. As part of this, we received an update on the Council's COVID business grant scheme, and we were pleased to hear that a total of 7.3 million was spent on these and distributed across the county in a manner consistent with the number of small and medium-sized businesses in each district. Other items taken were in relation to an update on the Thorpe. Sorry, I got interrupted there.
No need to apologise.
On the Thettlethorpe Geological Disposal Facility Working Group and the Landscapes Review for the Lincolnshire Wolds Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty. Future items at our April meeting, we are due to consider 2 pre-decision scrutiny reports. One, the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme, submission of outline business case for which the Executive will make a decision on the 4th of May. 2, and the Lincolnshire Minerals and Waste Local Plan, issues and options for updating the plan, the decision of which will be made again by the Executive in May. The committee is also expected to give an update on report about the Gibraltar Point, which will be combined with a Councillor Environment Away Day to visit this and other relevant sites on the coastal area. Further information will be provided in the next few coming weeks. Our committee work programme will remain busy, and in future months, with new items being added on page 231 to 232, such as adult education and community engagement and development programme, and the aforementioned report requests on recycling. Mr. Chairman, that includes my report. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the detailed report, Councillor Wootton. I've got 3 points, if I may. On the well, one is a point, one is 2 are points and questions, one is a comment. On the issue of installing electric charging points, whilst I appreciate it isn't in your gift where they go, Mr. Chairman, I think it's important that it's raised to you that if the people choose to install EVs, please, for the love of God, pardon my French, do they not take off disabled spaces? Because often in car parks there are too few of them anyway. As somebody who's disabled, my disabilities are fairly manageable compared to some people who struggle with disabilities. And when you see or you go to a car park and there used to be 6 disabled spaces and you see 2 have been taken by EV machines for charging points, it is, to be blunt, quite frustrating and actually quite vexing, because disabled badges are paid, you know, they're paid for. You've gone through a process to be considered acceptable, and then you find you can't park anyway because the spaces that would have been free have now had EV machines taken into them. I appreciate they need to go somewhere and we need to do what we can for climate change, but I think taking disabled spaces away for EV machines personally is not something that we should support, and it's something we should urge developers to think very carefully on whenever we're involved in any consultations.
Chair, I really fully sympathise with your views there, because I can only report on South Kesteven, because I know at South Kesteven disabled bases have been taken away for EV points, and that causes a concern. So I'll make sure that it's raised with our authority and also with this authority here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Do we have any data that proves SUDs, which is Sustainable Urban Drainage, are actually the best drainage system available to prevent flooding? If so, I'd be very appreciative if the Chairman would send me or any other member who is interested information, or could he ask officers to provide it? And I think it would be a benefit to members of the committee if they had the information, because although Her Majesty's Government say that is the best option, I was on a district planning committee for 4 years and never saw any quantifiable data of that. It was just, that's what it says in the National Planning Policy Framework, so you've got to do it. Because certainly my, shall I say, limited experience of having issues of flooding, certainly in a locality, if we get heavy downpours and freak climate events or 1 in 100 climate events, the SODs take so much and then they overflow, whereas you see older systems that were piped and they seem less prone to. So I'd be very interested to see where that information came from. And finally, Mr. Chairman, very briefly, could members whose divisions sit within the AONB be given details of the responses the Council plan to send as part of the Glover review?
Yes, I can certainly arrange that. Second question. On the first question you mentioned, I don't have personal experience on that, but I know that Kiera will get that information to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Does anybody else have any questions for Councillor Wootton on the work programme? If not, the actions of the board required to determine whether it's satisfied with Environment and Economy Scrutiny Committee work. Oh, sorry, have I missed one?
To go to Councillor Hall.
Sorry, Councillor Hall. Sorry, I do apologise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And firstly, I would just like to associate myself with the opening remarks that Councillor Rutten made with regards to Kiara. I think she does an absolutely fantastic job with supporting us as, in our roles. So thank you very much, Kiara. What members have in front of them under Appendix B, pages 232 to 234, is a snapshot of business undertaken by the Highways and Transport Scrutiny Committee since December 2021 and until our last meeting in January 2022. I will take the report as read and will only highlight our pre-decision debates in terms of the revenue and capital budget proposals for 2022 to 23, and that on the fifth local transport plan. Both were unanimously supported by the committee. On the first instance, the committee was satisfied that the major schemes programme remained affordable, and whilst acknowledging the impacts of the £12 million funding gap, we received assistance that there was ongoing work of leading officers and executive portfolio holders towards a future funding strategy as part of the Highways Infrastructure Asset Management Plan. We were also pleased to hear of the transfer of the transport to school services under the Highways budget, as we value the opportunity for further examination of that service to ensure that challenges were mapped and funds were used in the most effective way. In terms of the local transport plan, we were very pleased to hear that the consultation exercise that took place was one of the most successful in engaging a wide audience, exceeding expectations and offering a representative glimpse into current views. We were also satisfied that the plan was looking to reverse the negative picture of a declining bus service, partially owed to the pandemic. Moving on and taking a glance at future items, between pages 235 to 236, you have the opportunity to view the next 3 meeting agendas, including our forthcoming meeting on the 7th of March. At this, we will again be exercising our pre-decision scrutiny function over 3 decisions. First, we will review the North Highcombe Relief Road design and build contract procurement ahead of a decision by the Executive on the 5th of April on approving the award to Balfour Beatty and proceeding with all pre-construction elements of the contract. Secondly, we will discuss the adoption and implementation of the Advanced Payment Code Exceptions Policy ahead of a decision by the Executive Councillor for Highways and Transport and IT between the 14th and 18th of March. This report seeks to receive approval of the adoption and implementation of the policy by Lincolnshire County Council in relation to accepting certain new developments from the Advanced Payment Code process where a development site meets criteria specified in the report. Lastly, we are due to receive a report on the bikeability procurement. Bikeability is being delivered to more than 200 schools in Lincolnshire and to more than 4,500 pupils. As the current contract is due to expire, officers will seek our views and recommendation to the executive decision maker on approving the decision to retender the contract. Further to these, the committee will also receive an annual update from the Road Safety Partnership, as well as a report on highways, gully cleansing, repair and service water flooding. This concludes my update to the board. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor, and apologies for missing you earlier. Are there any questions? Councillor Marfleet.
Thank you, Chairman. Just on that gullies and highways one, which is on March the 7th, my birthday. So just for your information. So my request for a present is actually to resolve the gully systems. I have highlighted this actually through to Sean Butcher and Andy, because we haven't got all the gullies mapped on the sort of the mapping system. I have just sent you an email about this, and there is an issue because a lot of my parishes say they come and do X number, but they miss off a few along the way. And it's quite a few parishes come up with this. Now, the problem is it's how we're going to connect back, because what they're saying is we'll use the parish councils or the councillor, but in my area, I might have a lot of areas of villages that don't have parish councils. And so, in effect, we end up with a void again, because it's either down to me to go and frog march all round, and I haven't really quite got the time. So there is a void within how we are going to do the mapping. And I just want to raise that with you, that you sort of take that forward, because I think somehow we have to, as everyone knows here, there are pockets that we need to somehow fill in. And I think it's a bit of a, Highways is even sort of struggling on how to do it. So between us all, we've got to come up with a solution. Thank you.
Councillor Wotton.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I noticed on page 234 you've got civilian parking enforcement. It's an area where I receive quite a lot of complaints, particularly on vehicles parking on WL lines outside takeaways. Now, I've tackled this with the local enforcement officer, and he tells me that he's been given instructions that he cannot issue a ticket unless he observes them for 15 minutes, which seems ludicrous. Because where I served in the police, if I saw somebody on a WL line, I'd move them on or give them a ticket straight away. So I can't understand why vehicles were given that free ticket for 15 minutes. Just that's something that you could look at when you're looking at civilian enforcement restrictions. Thank you.
If you wish to come back, Councillor Holden, please do.
Yeah, we will look into that, and you know, your concern has been noted. Thank you very much.
Councillor Mrs. Keeley. Your microphone's gone off.
Just to say that I've had the same problem in my division as well, where a ticket couldn't be issued because the police hadn't actually been present, and they had to be present for a certain amount of time. And people, you know, people are breaking the law because they know that.
Yep, Councillor Dilkshire.
I'd just jump on that one as well. Thank you, Councillor Wotton, for raising it. I think it's universal. I've got a case with people parking on WL lines outside shops, and buses can't get through, and the bus operator, I'll say it's Delane's, are threatening to withdraw the bus, which is much used and needed. And so I welcome those comments and hope it can be looked at. Thank you.
Councillor Mrs. Brockway.
Thanks. Just to add to the number of complaints, you know, we're going to get in here while we can. An interesting problem is starting to rise in my division, and it's repeated, where our people have gone in and done really excellent work on the roads. But what they've done is they've raised the level of the roads above curbs and things like that, and it's now causing flooding to individual properties. I've now had my 4th complaint where the properties have been flooded, and it's actually very difficult to get the people to go back and to correct their work. I even had one response, well, they shouldn't have bought a property which is down below the surface of the road. And I thought, no, we're not going to accept that, thank you. But it is an increasing, because the repairs, repeated repairs, they're raising the levels of the road. And some of the flooding is actually quite bad, so I'll write in to you about that, because you've got something on that on the 7th of March. Thank you.
Councillor Strangle.
Thank you, Chairman. I might as well jump in as well. Just to go back a while, I mean, I'm in my 9th year now on the Highways Committee altogether, and I remember when this came in regarding PCNs, etc., and the decision was at that time that the 15 minutes was that you could not return they give you those 15 minutes, but it was never mentioned about on double yellow lines. And I remember parking near the Terrace, which is a city council-owned office building, and there was no yellow lines at all. And yet one of those, I call them jolly green giants, which got the green hat on. He came up to me and he started taking my number. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm just taking your number, so if you return here within 15 minutes, I'll give you a notice." And I said, "All right, fair enough." But that was without any yellow lines at all. So I don't know what's happening with the yellow lines, but certainly I understand it from the Highways Code. If you park on double yellow lines, you can get fined for it. It's as simple as that. So it is something I think, Alex, you need to look into and take it back to Highways. Thank you.
I'll briefly follow on from that. You are correct, Councillor Strengle. The exception is if you have a blue badge and you display your blue badge and clock, you can park there for 2 hours. Otherwise, you are quite correct. You should not park on double yellow lines at all. And even if you have a blue badge, you cannot cause an obstruction and park on them. Councillor Davies raised this at council, actually. I believe it was Section 6 of the Highway Act. I'd have to look through again. But the county's looking to take over this responsibility because the police just simply aren't enforcing it. I was in one of my parishes yesterday, and it was chucking out time at school, and I pulled over to take a picture of a sizable pothole, actually, and there were cars as far as you could see on one side of the road, and one literally was on the junction, not so many feet away from it, as you're supposed to be by law, but on it. Thankfully, it wasn't a narrow junction, so people could see, but if it had been a narrow junction, that could have caused serious problems. So there is an issue, and I appreciate the police don't have oodles of resources and are understaffed, undermanned. You know, we've all got issues in our budgets, as we all know, but hopefully, if the county do take this over under that section, under the Highways Act, it might resolve some of these problems. We then might get complaints that our residents being ticketed by overzealous parking wardens, but you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, I think. Yeah, Councillor Wootton.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. Going back to, I mean, when I served in the police, we had traffic wardens, proper traffic wardens, yeah. And then they were civilianised, and unfortunately the rules were changed, and it's a free-for-all, particularly about schools. But I'd like to thank the Highways Committee for listening to my concerns about parking outside the schools, because in our area in Grantham, they're actually proposing now to put weighting restrictions outside schools to stop people parking there, blocking up the street during that time. So thank you for that.
Not seeing any further questions, Councillor Hall will be relieved to know. The board is required to determine whether it is satisfied with the activity undertaken since November 21 by the Environment and Economy and Scrutiny Committee and the Highways Authority. Sorry, the Highways and Transport Scrutiny Committee. The board is required to determine whether it is satisfied with the plan work programme of the Environment and Scrutiny Committee and the Highways and Transport Scrutiny Committee. I propose the board is satisfied with the activity undertaken since November 2021 and the plan work programmes of the Environment and Scrutiny Committee and the Highways and Transport Scrutiny Committee. Can all those in favour please show? That is unanimous, but I will ask any abstentions or anybody against. Seeing none, we are now on to item 14, when I can get my paper. And this item sets out the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board's work programme for 2022 and is for information only. There is one amendment to the work programme. The insurance strategy report has been deferred from the March meeting, the 24th, to the 28th of April meeting. That now concludes the business of the meeting. Thank you everyone for your attendance, and I wish you all a safe journey home.